One day the man returned home, and he was not alone. He brought the young man a younger brother from distant lands. At the same time, he assumed that his younger brother was a little demon. He tried to tell his father the truth, but his younger brother started threatening him back. And yet, like a true older brother, he decided to turn a blind eye to the oddities, because that's the fate of an older brother, to cover up the younger one's mischief. Meanwhile, the young lady was quietly correcting the information in her older brother's diaries, in her own way. At the same time, he really wanted to become a glorious knight who was worthy of his blade. She sighed heavily, as she had previously asked brother to stop writing about her in his diary and to tighten security. But moments later, she put the diary down with a smile, because she knew that he still liked her. The house was plunged into chaos, and the little girl contributed to it, because the youngest in their family, Rubian, turned out to be a girl. Some time ago, I was leisurely walking across the battlefield in search of the living. A moment later, he heard a loud noise. He was puzzled because he saw that the village had been wiped off the face of the earth. But at the same time, he understood that at least someone had to survive. At that very moment, he turned around at the noise, and without any thought, he pointed his trusty sword at the little child. He was taken aback and looked in surprise at the boy, who was trembling with fear. The Duke was very surprised, as he did not expect to see a small, defenseless child in a mountain of corpses. He looked at the boy closely and, putting away his sword, declared that he had no need to be afraid, as it would not harm him. The Duke asked the boy if he was really looking for any food. He extended his hand to the boy and declared that the war was over and they could leave. The young man looked intently at the Duke and in a trembling voice asked if it was true that the war was over. The Duke looked tenderly at the little child and at that very moment declared that the war was over. The war between people and black magicians lasted 10 long years. He spent all these years on the battlefield, and with the death of the black sorcerer who had started the war, the countless conflict came to an end. Taking the child in his arms, he declared that now it was all over. He also asked the boy for forgiveness with sadness in his voice for not being able to come earlier. The Duke told his companion that he needed to drink water and eat, as he was very weak. But a moment later, the Duke was taken aback, as the boy appeared to him in a dream and hugged him. He looked at the Duke with embarrassment and asked for forgiveness, as he had frightened him. The Duke was taken aback for a moment and looked at the boy in bewilderment, as he did not understand why his eyes were so big. He sighed heavily and asked the boy if he had parents, brothers, sisters, or any distant relatives. But the boy said that he had no one. Without wasting a minute, the boy grabbed hold of the Duke tightly, while the man looked at the boy in bewilderment, as he did not expect such a thing. At that very moment, the Duke assumed that the boy wanted to go with him, and a moment later he confirmed his thoughts. He realized that the boy had a hard time, since he asked to be with a stranger. The Duke said that if the boy was not from the magical kingdom, everything should be fine. After all, it is so closed that without the highest permission of the king, they won't let you move from there, let alone even to a neighboring region. After some time, they sat quietly by the fire, and then the Duke declared that when they returned to the empire, he would find shelter for the boy. He looked at the boy in surprise and asked if he was cold. At that very moment, she looked in surprise at the coat of arms that was on her clothes. She was shocked because she realized who was in front of her. At that very moment, all her doubts were erased, as she found the man she had been looking for a long time. It so happened that in the middle of the damned battlefield, memories of her past life, which she had managed to forget, returned to her. She was reborn in a novel, the plot of which told of a war between people and a dark magician. And the hero who brought victory to that war was now standing before her, namely Duke Leviathan Siebert. The Duke looked at the boy with a smile and declared that he had already prepared everything. He ended the war by defeating the continent's greatest dark mage in the body of a human without magic. And that was the ending of Volume 1 of the original story. But unfortunately, there was a problem that he died unexpectedly. In Volume 2, the king of the magical kingdom resurrected a dark mage, and the death of the Leviathan, who was destined to prevent this, untied the sorcerer's hands, and the entire continent again turned into a battlefield. She was in shock because she realized that the ending was too crazy, and she, an extra, was the perfect victim. She understood that she had to prevent a sad ending, so she asked the gentleman with a smile if he needed a younger child in the family. At that very moment, she heard a sharp and cold refusal. She was shocked and didn't understand why he would suddenly say something like that. He sighed heavily and declared that he would only take him as far as the capital's shelter. She screamed that he should accept her as a junior. The Duke sighed heavily as he saw that the boy was about to collect all the dust from the ground. He looked at the boy in bewilderment and asked why he suddenly started talking about the younger one. The young lady suggested that she had been hasty and should have waited a little, rather than asking for adoption after just a few hours of meeting. She knew she was in a hurry, but she knew that after such a long battle on the battlefield, they had finally met. In truth, she didn't even know how the one she wanted to protect would die. A lot happened in her new life, and so she forgot the plot of the book. In truth, she was dragged to the battlefield by the force on the king's orders. She brought up that she was a mage from a magical kingdom and a child soldier, and it couldn't be worse than that. After the Allied countries vehemently condemned the use of child soldiers, mages her age were recalled to the rear along with her. But even if such children were assigned to rear support in the middle of the battlefield, they still had to balance on the brink of death and life. And after spending a whole year at the front, she realized that this place was the world from that very book. She deserted to meet the Leviathan. The Magic Kingdom was a closed country, and it was clear what would happen if she was caught again after deserting. So she desperately eluded her pursuers all this time, after which she met the one she was looking for. But unfortunately, he hated magicians because of an incident 10 years ago. She understood that she had to hide her identity and not die by some stupid accident, since she was a deserter, a magician, a child, a soldier. The Duke looked at the boy in surprise, because he did not understand why he was behaving strangely. He asked the boy if he was really offended by what he said. He didn't understand what other guy would be upset over such nonsense. The young lady was taken aback, as he mistook her for a boy. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked which guy he was talking about. Rubian understood that even if she was a deserter and a fugitive, changing her gender was too much. After some time, they continued on their journey, but the Duke noticed that the boy was too talkative. She continued speaking, but a moment later, she was taken aback as the Duke closed her eyes. He easily dealt with the monster that they encountered on their way, but asked the boy not to look. Rubian, in turn, followed his words. At that very moment, the Duke stated that they were still at the border, where there were many such creatures. Looking at his companion, he asked if he was very scared. The Duke shouted that everything would be fine, but at that very moment, he heard a scream. Rubian screamed and asked if he really called himself the greatest swordsman since he dealt with the beast, and after which there was a lot of blood around, and she didn't even have spare clothes. Leviathan was taken aback and asked for forgiveness, but at the same time, he asked if he really wasn't scared at all, and he began to wipe the boy. Rubian was lost in thought, as she knew that she could obtain the moonflower grass, which was perfect for drawing out the blood of the black demonic beasts. The Duke looked at his companion in bewilderment and asked why he was not crying at all, since throughout the entire time he had never cried once. She was taken aback as she realized that it had come out awkwardly and wondered if she really didn't look like a normal child at all. She knew that the Duke had been on the battlefield for a long time, and he radiated an unchildish pressure so that ordinary children would immediately cry upon seeing his figure. Rubian said she was scared, but crying wouldn't change anything. To her regret, she knew that even in her past life she had cried little. She knew that instead of crying, it would be better to spend this time solving the problem. Rubian said that if she cried, she would be told she was too noisy. He looked at his companion in surprise and asked who had told him that tears didn't change anything. She was taken aback and said that it was most likely her mother. At that very moment, the Duke tenderly touched her nose, and at that very moment, he began to torture his companion. Rubian was in shock, did not understand what he was doing at all. The Duke looked closely at the boy and declared that if he kept everything inside for too long, he could get sick. Moments later, he declared that they should wash the animal's blood out of his hair. On the way to the capital, they talked about everything: simple conversations and banter, a few fleeting stupid jokes, what they liked and didn't like. This trifle filled their journey. But after some time, she asked the Duke if there were really no more monsters. The Duke said with a smile that he had killed everyone. Rubian noted with a smile that he really was very strong. Achieving such a peace must have been incredibly difficult after 10 years, as she barely survived 2 years of war. At that moment, Rubian looked at the Duke and thanked him for saving her. She also thanked him for his hard work on the battlefield, because thanks to him, there was peace. Rubian asked with a smile, since he had already saved her, how about taking her in as the youngest? But after some time, the Duke still left the little boy in a beautiful orphanage. He looked at the boy closely and stated that he had fun with him, but at the same time, he said goodbye to the dirty boy. Some time later, Madame greeted the boy with a smile at the imperial orphanage. She treated the boy to wonderful food, as the cook tried his best for him. Rubian was furious because the Duke had disowned her as soon as they set foot in the capital. She wondered if her request was so exorbitant. Unfortunately, her anger overwhelmed her. Her head was spinning. She understood that there was little mana accumulated in the imperial capital, and that simply being in such a place was draining it from Sokka. At that very moment, the young man approached the new kid and asked if everything was okay with him, as he looked exhausted. Rubian looked at the boy in surprise, as he was unbearably beautiful. She stated that she was not sick, but that thoughts were just crowding in her head and demanding a solution. He said with a smile that he could listen to her and help. Rubian was puzzled, as she knew she had to save the Duke, even though she had hidden her essence. But she understood that he was a scoundrel, because he abandoned her and did it with merciless cruelty. She knew she had to see him again to prevent this from happening, otherwise he might fall. The young man was surprised and looked at the newcomer, as he saw that he was excited about something. He asked with a gentle smile what was troubling him so much. Rubian sighed heavily and stated that she was simply trying to tame her childhood fears. He looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected to hear anything like that. At that very moment, the lady came up to them and looked at the boy in surprise, as he had eaten everything. She smiled and stated that since he had already finished his meal, they could measure his mana. She was shocked, as she did not expect such a thing. The madam said that they had to measure her, since there was a collapse on the fugitive magician now, so they had to check everyone. She was in shock, since she understood that this was the end for her. Meanwhile, the Duke was closely examining the territories during a meeting with his friend. The Emperor looked into the distance with a smile as he saw the beautiful lands. They seemed limitless to him, even within the walls of the palace. The Duke looked at the Emperor intently and asked him to drop all pleasantries, as he wanted to talk business. The Emperor reported that the Kingdom of Magicians was asking for assistance in capturing a fugitive magician, and a detachment of magicians following through the gorge was wiped off the face of the earth, but the body of one of them was never found. The Duke sighed heavily and declared that he had probably fallen into some abyss. He wondered if he really had to clean up after the magicians as well. The Emperor smiled and told his comrade that he had grasped his form, so he asked him to calm down and calm his incinerating aura, for otherwise his syllables might have fallen dead from horror. He assumed that the Duke wanted nothing to do with the magical kingdom, but at the same time, the Emperor believed that this was too much for his part. At that very moment, the Duke looked at the Emperor with anger and declared that he no longer wished to hear anything about this matter. At that very moment, the young people fell to the ground with a crash and began to shake with fear. But they were still worried about the Emperor. He reassured them and said that he was fine, and they could leave. Dietrich declared that in that case, he would take matters into his own hands. The Duke immediately showed his gratitude. The Emperor laughed. At that very moment, the Emperor said that he had heard that, on his way to the palace, the Marquis had witnessed a curious scene. Dietrich said with a smile that the mayor had told him that the Duke had been amazingly gentle with some child. He asked the Duke if he was thinking about adoption again. The Emperor declared that the North was not the most suitable place for a child's soul, although his sons had taken root there, but it was unlikely that the boy would endure such a thing. The Duke understood that the Emperor's words were full of meaning, because there were still monsters in the North, and even adults had a hard time. He understood that a small boy like Rubian would hardly be able to survive in such a place. He couldn't doom the child, send him north just for selfish reasons, but he still wanted to visit the boy before leaving the capital. Meanwhile, the women were talking to each other, and they couldn't believe that thieves had broken into the imperial orphanage. They knew that one of the children had been hurt, and upon hearing this, the Duke froze in horror. A little earlier, something very terrible happened near the shelter. The young lady breathed heavily as she looked at the man who was raging. She was in shock, as she knew she had only used a little magic, but was already on the verge of exhaustion. She planned to escape through the restroom to avoid inspection, but right before her eyes, the child, frightened by the thief, fainted. Since the thief had spotted her, she had to deal with it with magic, but it made her feel like she would soon lose consciousness. She wanted to find the Duke as soon as possible and confess to him completely. But at the same time, she was very scared and wondered if he would leave her again. She understood that, most likely, no one needed her in this world. But at the same time, she knew that because of the severe condition, stupid thoughts were creeping into her head. Rubian knew she needed to stop worrying about herself and just move on. But first, she wanted to rest a little, and a moment later, she fell with a crash in an empty alley. The young man looked closely at his friend and inquired about the child's condition. Lion stated that the boy was fine, but he was just very tired. But he would wake up soon. The man sighed heavily as he felt relief. At that very moment, the knight said that he had never seen the Duke in such a fierce rage for the child. Leviathan looked at all of his subordinates with fury and declared that they must quickly find the boy, while he gave a clear description. After some time of searching, he finally found a little boy lying on the ground in a damp alley. The Duke was burning with anger and fury, as he realized that he had left the boy in a very bad state. Lion knew that the boy was from an orphanage, but he was surprised because the Duke unexpectedly showed his other side to everyone. After some time, the young lady finally opened her eyes. She was taken aback because she didn't understand where she was and looked around hastily. At that very moment, the Duke called her and declared that they were now in the temporary barracks and that this place was safe. He looked closely at the boy and stated that he had been told earlier that he had passed out due to exhaustion, so the Duke had brought him food. At that very moment, the Duke announced that he had brought him a change of clothes. Rubian quickly looked at herself and exhaled, as she realized that they had only taken off their jacket and had not seen anything. At that very moment, the Duke measured her body temperature. Leviathan looked closely at his companion and stated that his temperature had dropped a little, but he also began to examine him. Rubian looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he was really looking for her. The Duke said with a smile that it was so. He rushed to the shelter when he heard about the robbers, but he was very much overcome with horror when he learned that the boy was missing. Leviathan asked the boy why he went into the alley at all, and he sighed heavily because he understood that the boy needed to be kept under close watch. Rubian stated that in that case the Duke should keep her close to him so that nothing would happen. The Duke smiled and stated that he planned to do something similar. She was taken aback and asked in surprise what he said. The Duke sighed and declared that the boy should chew in silence. She couldn't stand it, and at that very moment asked if he would really take her with him. She didn't understand why he changed his mind. The Duke said that it wasn't that he was against it, but their world was finally at peace, and so he wanted the boy to be safe. He wanted the boy to enjoy life where it was not cold, where there were no monsters. He wanted the sweet child to live a peaceful life. But the young lady understood that a normal life was never in the cards for her. At that very moment, she declared to the Duke that the place next to him was the calmest, and therefore, even in the cold, even among monsters, she would follow him. Rubian looked at the Duke intently as she waited for an answer. At that very moment, the Duke announced with a smile that in that case he had no choice, and when the heat subsided, they would still go north together. After some time, the Duke asked his companion if everything was well with his health. She could not resist and declared that she was fine, no matter how much she repeated it. The Duke sighed and stated that he asked about such things because he was worried. Rubian said with a smile that she understood everything, but they must hurry with the formalization of guardianship. The man looked at them intently and stated that they must read the document carefully and sign it. Rubian looked at the documents with a satisfied smile, as she understood that this was better than adoption, since she planned to leave the family when she achieved her goal. The care reminded her of life in the orphanage in her past life. She remembered how lost she was, and when she left the orphanage, but this time she intended to do everything carefully. Putting aside all her thoughts, she looked at the Duke, who declared that she must sign the document. A moment later, the young lady read the contract and signed it. At that very moment, the Duke laughed at her handwriting as he assumed that she used an earthworm, but she shouted that this was the imperial language. A few minutes later, they said goodbye to the lawyer, who wished them a safe journey with a smile. The Duke looked at the boy intently and declared that it was his choice. He sighed heavily and said that the North was a very cruel place, so he did not adopt him right now, because it would not be too late to change everything when they went north, and then he would see everything for himself. She stated that she did not care about going north, and was just going to stay by his side. The Duke said with a smile that he was like a baby bird who was ready to follow his master everywhere. Leviathan looked at the boy with surprise, as he did not understand why he was so attached to him. But now he was the youngest in the Siebert family. Meanwhile, in the north, an old man was menacingly asking his subordinate who the Duke would bring with him. He was furious because his son was doing useless things. At that moment, the man was taken aback and asked the gentleman what they should do. The old man glared at his subordinate, and with his fierce grin declared that they had to make sure that the child could survive in the north, so they had to give him a test. After some time, the young lady asked the Duke for forgiveness. She felt ill on the road and was nauseous. He said that Rubian should not worry and should drink water slowly to make him feel better. She was puzzled, because she didn't think that she would get sick in the carriage. The Duke, looking at the boy, declared that this would not do, and that they should continue riding. Lion, in turn, approached the Duke and called him. They both looked at the knight in bewilderment. The young man apologized for interrupting their conversation. The Duke asked his subordinate in surprise what had happened. The young lady looked closely at the knight, as she knew that he was originally the most loyal to the Duke. But looking at the man, she understood that he didn't like her. At that very moment, the knight declared that he would put the child on his horse. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected such a thing. Lion stated that the fresh air would not rock the child so much, but he also noted that the Duke needed rest. Lion stated that the Duke had hardly slept by the time they reached this place. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. At that very moment, she realized that he had not slept because of her, since he had previously courted her, and then they had ridden in a carriage. At that very moment, the Duke looked at the boy and declared that his knight was exaggerating, since he was not tired at all. Lion, in turn, looking intently at the Duke, declared that even the strongest knight would collapse if he slept only a few hours for several days. The Duke shouted at his subordinate not to frighten the child with his words. At that very moment, she understood everything and declared that she would go with Lion, and at the same time, she pulled him by the collar of his clothes. Rubian looked menacingly at the Duke and declared that he must immediately go to sleep in the carriage. The Duke looked at him with a smile and declared that he was indeed all right, but she did not pay any attention to his words, and reached out to the knight and asked him to help her sit up. Rubian looked at the Duke with a smile and declared that refusal would not be accepted. For this reason, he should go and get a good night's sleep. The Duke only looked at Rubian with a smile, as he realized that there was no point in arguing with him. After some time, they were riding on the road, and at the same time, the young League watched the Duke, who was sleeping quietly in the carriage. She sighed heavily as she saw that he was sleeping and did not understand why he was so stubborn. Lion told the boy that he spoke in a disrespectful tone. Therefore, he must show due respect to the Duke, and the man asked the boy why he wanted to go with their Duke in the first place. She looked at the knight in surprise and declared that it was all because he had picked her up. Lion sighed heavily and sadly told the boy to forget about the quiet life in the Duke's house, because the North was no place for children. He stated that the exiled monsters were constantly attacking and trying to reclaim their lands, and in the North there was war all year round. Lion told the boy that this was not the paradise he dreamed of. She sighed heavily, as she realized that he was just a boor. But at that very moment, she realized that her uncle's homeland was a dangerous place. She was shocked, as he had spent his entire life fighting monsters, and later spent several years on the battlefield. At the same time, she understood that dying after everything was too much. At that very moment, she shouted that there was no need to be sad, because she wanted to try. But a moment later, she turned around and looked at her companion in bewilderment, as he was writhing in pain. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what had happened, because she saw how he was covered in sweat and shaking with pain. Lion, in turn, repeated that he was fine, so they could continue on their way. But the Duke declared that they would first set up camp and rest, and then leave. The Duke looked at his comrade in surprise and asked why he had even hidden the fact that his wound was worse than it seemed, since it was a violation of military orders. The young man sighed heavily and stated that he simply did not want to inconvenience his squad. At that very moment, the young lady looked intently at the knight and declared that the war was over, and there was no longer any need to endure and hurry. She said that they weren't going to war, but were returning home. At that very moment, she felt awkward when she said such words. He sighed heavily and declared that the boy was right, and the war was indeed over. The Duke said with a smile that they were done with it. At that very moment, the Duke declared that since they were heroes, they needed to return home alive and well, so that their struggle for life would be in vain. Rubian looked at them with a smile, as she understood that the situation was very touching. Rubian endured it for a long time, but she was still puzzled. Because the ointment smelled strongly, she did not understand how they still used something like this. The Duke asked in surprise why the boy had run away, but he said that he stank. The Duke smiled and said that he would be a knight, and that he had to endure this kind of thing. That same night, the young lady did not sit in vain, because she knew that in the magical kingdom, the medicines were much more advanced. While the Duke was at the meeting and the camp was free, she prepared the ointment. Rubian easily transferred the prepared ointment into a container, adding finely chopped herbs that she had collected near the camp. A moment later, she was finishing the last preparations, and Rubian was happy because there was no smell and the effect of the ointment was better. For a few seconds she heard her friend. The young lady was shocked because she did not expect to hear from him, but he asked with a smile where she had been. She froze for a moment in surprise and wondered if she had already heard her comrade Khalid. At that very moment, he sighed heavily and greeted his mistress with confidence. She met a young man in the very heat of war. Because chance brought her to a cave where the boy was languishing tied up, it was not in her nature to pass by someone else's misfortune, so she saved him. From that day on, he swore allegiance to her and began calling her mistress. The oath of a mage is like a shackle that binds their mana. It allows them to feel the life of another, like a thread connecting their souls. He said that she suddenly disappeared, cutting off the flow of mana so he could not find her. He sadly asked if she could imagine what he felt. Rubian sighed heavily and asked the young man for forgiveness, as she had run headlong to meet the Duke. A moment later, he declared that it didn't matter and asked if she was really in Babylon now. She was taken aback because she didn't understand how he knew where she was. He smiled and said that he could see she was scared, and that it was very sweet. Khalid said, without further ado, that he would be with her soon, so she should wait for him. She was shocked that he decided to make such a journey, because it was quite far to get to her. The next day, the young lady brought the knight a small gift in the form of a fine ointment. She looked at the officer with a smile and stated that the ointment smelled unbearably, so she mixed it with herbs. Lion was taken aback, as she didn't expect to hear anything like that from a little boy. At that very moment, he thanked the boy for the gift he had given him, and also asked for forgiveness for having been angry with him earlier. Lion knelt before the boy and declared that he should call him Sir. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why she would do something like that. The Duke looked at his comrade with a smile and declared that he was surprised. He then asked when was the last time he had allowed someone to call him that way. Leon declared that since the boy intended to live in the northern lands, he would join the knightly order. At that very moment, the young lady imagined the knights of the north, but she was a little puzzled because she understood that she was not a knight at all, but a wizard. Leviathan looked at the boy with a smile and stated that Leon liked him, but at the same time, he stated that they could look at a small gift. The Duke looked at the small box of ointment in surprise and asked where he knew the recipe, since mixing random ingredients was unlikely to improve the smell. Rubian said with a smile that her mother was a healer and that he learned by watching her. This was an absolute lie. They were shocked and wondered if he had learned it just by observing. They wanted to know if he knew anything about wild herbs too. At the same time, the young people said that the boy was simply a genius. Leon was taken aback and shouted to the Duke to give him his ointment, since it was a gift. The improved ointment immediately gained popularity among the knights. While they were resting in the camp, the knights got her a spacious carriage with its large windows, and thanks to this, she no longer felt seasick, and they finally reached their destination. After some time, the young lady looked at the Duke's domain with surprise and a smile. I saw snow-covered plains, and also snow-covered mountains, where no people were visible. She sighed heavily and wondered if they had really gone to hell. The Duke looked at the boy with bewilderment and asked what he was even talking about, since this was his domain. She saw barren, lifeless mountains, canyons where the eerie cries of animals echoed, a harsh land where in winter the snow is metals taller than a man. He sighed heavily and stated that the area was darker than he expected. The Duke asked the boy if he had already regretted going on such a journey. She declared that nothing would frighten her. The Duke said with a smile that he was glad to hear such a thing. But the young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why everyone was laughing and looking at her. After some time, they arrived at the Duke's fortress. For some time, she did not take her eyes off the beautiful and the huge fortress. She knew that members of the Siebert family lived in the main fortress. The former Duke and Leviathan's father, Balrog Siebert, abandoned his post after being wounded on the front lines, and was said to live out the rest of his days in a fortress, and hardly appeared in the original story. The Duchess and her eldest son were now in the south, so besides the previous Duke, only her second son, Boyd, remained in the fortress. After some time, they entered the castle, and the servants greeted the Duke. She was shocked as she saw that the castle was inhabited by servants who had served the family for centuries. She looked at everyone present and wondered if the harsh life in such a place had made them like this. She looked in surprise at the maids, who were incredibly pumped up. Rubian, in turn, wondered if everything in the north was really that huge. The butler greeted the Duke with a smile and assumed that he was tired from the journey. At the same time, he inquired about the child. At that very moment, the Duke introduced the child to everyone and stated that he had written about him in a letter. The young lady was taken aback and immediately hid behind the Duke, as she saw that they were looking at her like predators. She looked at everyone present and greeted them, introduced herself, and stated that she looked forward to meeting everyone. Everyone was simply stunned by the boy's greeting, and at the same time they saw that he was very sweet. At that very moment, the Duke raised his companion. The Duke looked at the boy with a smile and asked why he was shaking. He wanted to know if the boy was embarrassed. She was in shock and screamed that she was not so weak. She looked intently at the Duke, even having lowered her age in order to appear innocent, but in fact she was 10 years old. Everyone present was surprised, as they thought the boy was only 6. She was shocked and didn't understand why they were so surprised. At that very moment, the Duke said with a smile that they had to be careful because the baby was biting. She was shocked and screamed for him to let her go immediately. At that very moment, everyone present turned around because they heard a scream. At that very moment, the boy bounced off the step and jumped from the second floor to his father, doing a somersault in the process. In turn, he landed on the ground with ease, and it was graceful on his part. At that very moment, he called his father with a joyful smile and declared that they had not seen each other for a long time. The young lady looked closely at the boy, as she realized that he was the Duke's second son, Boyd Siebert. They stared at each other for a moment without saying a word. But a moment later, the Duke called his son, and he came to his senses. He asked his father for forgiveness, as he had gotten too carried away. The Duke did not want to listen to anything, because looking at his son, he noticed with a smile that he had grown up a lot. The boy was embarrassed, and immediately began to bombard his father with questions, and he also quickly told him that he studied well and ate well. The Duke said with a smile that this was wonderful. Boyd looked closely at the boy and asked if he was going to stay and live with them. She looked at him in surprise and greeted him, but at the same time, she noticed that he was much more alive than she expected. Boyd came from a sideline of orphans who lost their parents in the war. The couple adopted him, making him their second son. Despite his past, darkened by the war, he was full of cheerfulness and carelessness. Rubian looked intently at the boy and immediately said her name. At that very moment, he introduced himself with a smile and declared that he was 11 years old. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what this meant. He immediately asked how old she was. She stated that she was only 8 years old. He joyfully shouted that Rubian was younger than him, and he was filled with joy, since there was someone younger in the castle. She sighed heavily, as he had just called her Junior. Boyd looked at the boy with a smile and welcomed him to his new family, and he also called him Baby. Boyd shouted with a joyful smile that he had a little friend and that he could now carry him in his arms everywhere. At that very moment, the butler told the Duke that the Lord was unable to come due to illness. The Duke sighed and said that he would introduce the boy to him a little later. Boyd asked his father with a smile if he would go to the office. As he wanted to go with him, Duke agreed with his son. Boyd was shouting with joy and carrying his little brother in his arms, but the Duke said that he should first let his little brother go to the ground. Boyd hurriedly shouted to the Duke that he would now bring him the test with the highest score and all the records of his fencing training. He also shouted that he would play with the baby later. The butler told the Duke with a smile that he seemed to have found common ground with the younger gentleman. The Duke stated that this was so, since they were father and son. The butler stated that the Lord had a terrifying appearance and a strong aura, so the young master always cried when he saw him as a child, and seeing this, the Lord shortened their meetings. But now the butler was glad that everything had changed for the better. The lady looked closely at the Duke and declared that she understood everything because his face was really a little frightening. The Duke asked in surprise if his face was really that scary. At the same time, she screamed and pushed him away so that he would not pinch her. He said with a smile that the boy was just a wild animal. At that moment, the butler apologized for interrupting their lively conversation, but someone would like to meet Rubian. At that very moment, the maid greeted the little boy with a smile and introduced herself, as she was his personal maid. Hazel said with a smile that the boy was very tired after the long journey, so she suggested taking a bath. At that very moment, the young lady was already fidgeting, as she had not been in the bathroom for a long time. She really wanted to take a warm bath and soak in it, but she understood that if the maid began to help her, the truth about her gender would be revealed. He looked at him in surprise and asked what had happened. He was afraid that the boy's body was hurting again. At that very moment, she declared that this was not the matter at all. She called the Duke because she wanted to tell him something. She moved shyly closer to the Duke and said that she would like to whisper something in his ear. Rubian whispered that she had a big scar on her body, and she didn't want anyone to see it, so she asked if she could wash herself. The Duke was very angry when he heard this, but at that very moment, he handed the boy over to the maid and declared that they should prepare everything and help him if he only gave his consent, and in no case should they put pressure on him. The maid said that she understood everything, and at that very moment she took the boy, and with a smile they went into the room. The butler looked at the Duke in surprise, as he had never seen the child speak to him so freely. He said that everyone was surprised, but at the same moment he was taken aback, as he saw the menacing expression on the Duke's face. After some time, the young lady stood quietly in the bathroom and looked at her small scar, but she did not understand where she got it from. In any case, she knew that the problem now was different. Rubian knew perfectly well that if anyone saw the brand on her back, it would be clear that she was an escaped mage. She assumed that because the lands were once the beast's territory, mana was not as rare there as in the capital. At the very moment when she was sure that there was no one and decided to proceed with the plan, she understood that the mana that she had was enough to hide the brand. At the same time, she intended to use the mana around. She created a circle where her mana and the surrounding mana resonated in unison. She wanted to fill the lack of energy from the outside and cast a spell. A moment later, her brand disappeared. Coming closer to the mirror, she noticed that her eyes had returned to their original color. Turning around, she saw that the brand was perfectly hidden. Rubian felt happy because she used her powers after a long time. The maid asked the boy with a smile if he liked the bath, since he spent a lot of time there. She stated that she liked everything very much, since she had not taken a bath for a long time. The maid said with a smile that it was cold in the north, so there was nothing better than relaxing in warm water. At that moment, Hazel noticed that the boy was wearing clothes that were too big, and she said that they needed to make him new clothes. She screamed that it was okay because she could just roll up the sleeves and didn't have to buy a new one. They said it was cute. After some time, the maid said with a smile that the cook had prepared delicious dishes, especially for him. At that very moment, she was informed that she would be having dinner alone with her older brother. She knew that her chance had come, and sooner than she thought. Rubian knew that her new brother was a very brave boy. But at the same time, she was already convinced that he was very strong. For this reason, she thought that it would be easy to conquer him. But a moment later, she looked at her little brother in surprise, as he said with a joyful smile that his little brother required a lot of attention. He cut the meat with a joyful smile for his younger brother, Rubian. Looking at the boy, said that she could do everything herself. Boyd looked at the boy with a joyful smile and said that being an older brother was very difficult. She understood that she did not need to win him over, since he was already hers. But she, in turn, only obeyed his demands, since she did not want to put in much effort. She looked at the boy in surprise and asked why they were eating alone. She wanted to know where her uncle was. Boyd said, with a puzzled smile, that his father was always busy and he usually didn't eat with them. She looked at the boy in surprise, as this news was unexpected for her. She thought he would be upset that his father did not eat with them, but he seemed to be used to eating alone, although she understood that at his age, it was still too early to get used to loneliness. At that moment, the young lady, looking at her brother, wondered if she should use it now. She looked at him with a smile and said that she had brought something from the capital. She was pleased because she had prepared a gift for her older brother. He was taken aback and froze in place for a moment. But at that very moment, he jumped off his chair and asked his little brother what he was talking about. He quickly ran up to his brother, as he was surprised and at the same time happy to see a limited collection of hero cards. He was shocked and asked his brother if he had really given him such cards, since they were very valuable. The young lady immediately stated that it was a gift to him. She knew very well that playing cards were the best gift for children. When they were at the imperial market in the capital, she announced that she needed some money to buy something. The Duke saw that he was very brave to ask about such a thing, but he did not understand why he needed such cheap cards. At that very moment, the man declared that these were not cheap items, but collectible hero cards with illustrations of military heroes. She was delighted and shouted that they were excellent. She knew that in the original story, the boy really wanted the cards, but since they were in limited supply, he gave in and gave in. She didn't want to use them in the way he expected, but she was glad he liked it. Rubian looked at him with a smile, as she saw that he looked much better when he smiled. After some time, the young lady woke up, and she was in a very interesting position. Moments later, she came to her senses as if she had slept well. The Duke looked at the boy with a smile and said that it was obvious from the outside that he had slept well. At that very moment, he greeted the boy. She was shocked because he scared her, but at the same time, she did not understand why he was in her room. The Duke asked him with a smile to put on his slippers, but she told him not to change the subject. She wanted to know why he was in the room. Rubian knew that he had recently returned to the estate and must have been busy. She did not understand why he did not answer the question posed. At that very moment, the Duke casually declared that he looked well, and the rest was unimportant, and therefore he wanted to leave as quickly as possible. Rubian offered to have breakfast with him, but he refused, citing business. She asked if it was because he did not want to eat with Boyd. The Duke looked at him in surprise and said that, of course, it was not so. He did not understand who had told them such a thing. She sighed heavily and stated that she understood everything and it didn't matter. As he was leaving, the Duke said that as soon as he had sorted out his affairs, they would eat together. As soon as the Duke left, he sighed heavily. At the same time, he was a little glad that the boy had slept well that night. He was worried about him because it was his first night in a strange house. But luckily, everything went well. During the entire journey from the capital to the north, he hardly slept. The look of a small boy, covered in cold sweat and tossing and turning, made even stern knights worry. The Duke constantly looked after the boy and saw how he was covered in cold sweat and muttering something. The Duke assumed that the boy himself did not realize that he was having nightmares. He saw that the boy was cheerful and bright during the day, so no one dared to ask him about his dreams. The Duke wondered if the boy was dreaming about the attack on his home village every time, and he saw that the boy was tossing and turning in his sleep and muttering like a soldier who had survived the war. A moment later, all his thoughts vanished as the butler came up to him and called him. The Duke sighed heavily and declared that his head was spinning from the amount of work, and that strange thoughts were coming into his mind. Unfortunately, he knew nothing about Rubian, and even he could not understand how to properly communicate with his adopted son. At the same time, he understood that there was no worse father than him. At that very moment, the butler informed the Duke that he had received a letter from his wife. The Duke smiled and said that he had written to his wife to ask if she would mind if he brought Rubian, and it seemed that the answer had come just in time. She agreed with the Duke, but still wanted to hear his story upon his return. The butler stated that this was not surprising, since he personally brought the child for the first time. The Duke asked when his wife would return, and the butler said that she would return in about a month. At the same time, the Duchess hoped that he had not brought a girl home. Meanwhile, Boyd was looking at his new limited edition card with a happy smile. He was glad that he had a card with his father's picture on it, because it was the best of all. At the same moment, he rushed to his little brother, as he wanted to play with him, but when he opened the door, he was taken aback and froze for a moment in shock. At that very moment, he threw away all his cards and shielded his younger brother with his body, and angrily asked the maid what she was doing. They looked at the young gentleman in surprise, as they did not understand what he was talking about. He angrily asked why she had bullied his youngest. She was taken aback and said that she had done nothing wrong. She had simply wanted to fix the boy's hair. At that very moment, the young gentleman declared that this was a lie, since his junior was very frightened and he was trembling with fear. At that moment, the Duke entered the room and asked what was going on. Boyd began shouting and explaining the situation, but at that very moment, the young lady declared that she was fine. The young gentleman raised that this was not so, because he saw that his brother was trembling at the sight of the scissors. The Duke was taken aback, because he did not expect such a thing. At that very moment, he looked menacingly at the maid and told her to put them down immediately. The maid was taken aback and began to tremble with fear. At that very moment, they all knelt before the boy and asked for forgiveness for not having noticed that he was afraid of scissors. Rubian was taken aback and shouted that she herself didn't know that she was afraid of scissors. She didn't understand how they could have guessed something like that, but she shouted that everything was fine. The Duke smiled and praised his son for understanding everything in time. He raised his nose and declared that he had fulfilled his duties as an older brother well. At that moment, the Duke looked menacingly at the maids, but the lady asked him not to scold them. He said that he would let them get away with it today, but next time they should not expect forgiveness. At that very moment, they thanked him. The Duke looked at the boy with a gentle smile and declared that he could cut his hair whenever he wanted, and that he did not have to force himself to do something he did not like. He tenderly told the boy that even he had no right to force him to do anything. Rubian said with a smile that her bangs had grown out and were getting in her eyes, and it would be nice to get some kind of hair clip. The maid shouted that she would buy everything right away. At that very moment, the Duke tenderly touched her face and moved aside her beautiful hair. He smiled and stated that there was something in the East Room. He looked closely at everyone present and said that they could take some jewelry and use it as a hairpin. Everyone present was taken aback. Leviathan looked closely at the servants and said that they should go to the butler and get the keys from him. At the same time, the young lady looked at everyone present with bewilderment, since she did not understand which room they were talking about. Boyd asked how he was feeling, because his face was pale. She thanked her with a smile for her help, but she was fine. Adolf looked at his son in surprise and asked if it wasn't time for his fencing lesson. The boy was taken aback, as he had completely forgotten about it. A moment later, he was already rushing to class at full speed. The Duke looked after him in surprise, since he had simply asked a question about his son, and had already jumped up from his seat. The lady assumed that the Duke's expression was very frightening. After some time, the maids vented their anger. With tears in her eyes, she screamed that she was not at all fit to be a maid, since she did not even notice that the little gentleman was frightened. They understood that despite this incident, they had to protect him, since he had done something similar for them. The maids understood that he had a very kind heart, and at the same time, he was a very sweet child. At the same time, they knew that they would now serve him with all due care, so as not to make similar mistakes in the future. After all, he was an angel incarnate. But despite all this, for some reason, they imagined him in girls' clothes. After some time, the maids finally came to the eastern room. They noticed beautiful outfits and various toys for the girl, and after a few minutes, they saw beautiful hairpins for the girl. They knew that the Duke was to have a girl, and so they had many things, and if she were born, she would be the same as the youngest lord. The Duke's family hated him with all their hearts because of a certain incident. 10 years ago, a magician fled the kingdom, after which the Duchess accidentally found him lying on the road. He was weak and asked for only one thing: to help him cross the valley. The soft-hearted Duchess allowed him to go with her, and when they reached a deep gorge, he suddenly turned around and attacked the Duchess. As a result, the Duchess not only received serious injuries, but also lost her child. That is why they hated magicians so much. After some time, the maids looked at the boy with raw joy, for he was excellent. The young lady assumed that the maiden's things were prepared for the unborn child, although she did not know whether she could use them. At that very moment, the Duke looked intently at Rubian. She was taken aback for a moment, awaiting his verdict. But at that very moment, he said with a smile that something like that suited him very well, and he could keep the hairpin. She sighed heavily and looked at the Duke with embarrassment, as she understood that her secret should never be revealed. After all, she was a girl and also a magician. The Duke looked at Rubian in surprise and wondered if the scissors had frightened him. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a question. At that very moment, he asked the same question again, and then she declared that it was not the scissors themselves that frightened her more. She said hastily that she was frightened by the fact that the stranger held blades to her neck. The maids were taken aback, as they had not expected such a thing. She looked at everyone present in bewilderment and stated that it was not at all because of bad memories. At that moment, the Duke looked at her intently, and she said that they could do this when she got used to the castle. At that very moment, the Duke asked her if her hair at the back was bothering her. She was taken aback and declared that after he asked, it had started to bother her. Leviathan smiled and said that he could cut her hair, for if strangers frightened her, then with him she could be calm. She looked closely at the Duke, as he exuded a high level of confidence, was good with sharp objects, but still had no experience in cutting hair. Rubian immediately shouted that people without experience would not be accepted, because her head was not the head of a monster. They argued for a while, but after a moment she finally gave in and declared that he should listen to the maid's instructions and cut her hair. The Duke smiled and stated that he was actually her boss. Hazel shouted that she would pass on all her knowledge to him. A few minutes later, Duke Satella was surrounded by maids, and Rubian Satella was waiting for her haircut. At that moment, the Duke approached the boy and asked if his hair was cotton candy, as he had the feeling that it would melt as soon as it was in his mouth. She was shocked and screamed that he should not touch her, but after some confusion, the Duke nevertheless began to cut her hair. At the same time, the maids were very scared, as there were several small incidents, but after some time, he looked with ducal tenderness at the boy who was sleeping sweetly in his arms. At that very moment, Rubian woke up and, wiping her drool, asked when she had managed to fall asleep. Then the Duke presented the boy with a mirror, and she noticed that it turned out much better than she expected. Rubian said with a smile that he had managed to do the hard work, and now he could go to work as a hairdresser. At that moment, the Duke could not resist and bit his sweet hair. She was taken aback and quickly moved away from him, as she did not understand that he had done this at all. He sighed and noticed that her hair had not melted. She was shocked and screamed that her hair was not cotton candy at all. But at that very moment, the Duke of Salt easily lifted her up. He kissed her tenderly and said that her hair was very cute. She was shocked because he did whatever he wanted, but the Duke only smiled at her cries. At that very moment, she sheepishly declared that she was not angry with him because he had given her a good haircut, and Herzen thanked her with a smile. After some time, the young master looked at his younger brother with slight shock, as he thought that he was a fairy. Rubian asked the maids if the Duke would not have breakfast with them again. She was told that the Lord had many documents to review. Boyd said with a smile that his father would most likely be busy for a long time to come. At that very moment, he looked at his youngest and invited him to begin his meal. Rubian smiled and told the maid that she needed to go to the toilet, but as she was leaving, she asked her brother to start eating. On her way to the bathroom, she asked a maid if the Duke had deliberately avoided meals with Boyd. The maid did not answer her, and she realized that she had thought correctly. At that very moment, Hazel said that this was not so, and most likely the Duke was very busy today. She also said that every meal the young master suffered from indigestion, and for this reason they began to eat separately. She said that as soon as the young master arrived at the castle, he was terrified of the lord, as he was stern, and usually Lady Rosetta acted as a mediator between them, but she often felt unwell and was confined to the bed. Rubian realized that it most likely happened just when they lost their child and fell into despair. Rubian told the maid that she didn't want to go to the toilet anymore and they could go back. She knew she shouldn't have interfered in other people's family affairs, but after what happened today, she was very grateful to them. A moment later, the young man greeted his younger brother with a joyful smile. Rubian looked at her brother closely and asked if they should ask their uncle to eat with them. He was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear something like this from his younger brother. Rubian asked him if he didn't want to, or if he was still afraid of the Duke. He said that something not very pleasant had happened before his arrival, and he was still strict with him. Boyd said he was well aware that the Duke was avoiding him out of politeness, but he no longer feared him as he had before. Boyd, in turn, stated that it was still unexpected to ask the Duke to start dining with them without any particular reason. Rubian looked closely at the maid and asked if the Duke really had a lot of work. The maid stated that it was so. At that very moment, she looked at her brother with a predatory grin and declared that she had a great idea. He was taken aback and shuddered, because it seemed to him that there was a little devil in front of him. Some time later, while sitting in his office, the Duke heard a knock on the door. He sighed heavily and asked the man to leave the documents, and he would look at them later. But a moment later, he raised his head and was taken aback as he saw Rubian. The young lady, in turn, greeted my lord with a smile. At that moment, she bowed low and asked for forgiveness in advance. The Duke looked at the boy in bewilderment, as he did not understand where he had managed to get the glasses. Rubian, in turn, without wasting a minute, quickly placed the folder of documents on the Duke's desk. The Duke looked at the boy in bewilderment, as he did not understand what he had brought him. But at that very moment, Rubian smiled and asked the Duke to sign the documents. The Duke was surprised, because the boy brought him the whole contract, and at the same moment, he asked if he had really prepared everything himself. Rubian stated that this was indeed the case, but she also said that they intended to hold a welcome party in his honor in the dining hall. She stated that he should carefully study the documents and sign them. He noticed that Rubian dexterously used all sorts of tricks. At that very moment, the Duke signed the document with a smile and noticed that in front of him was simply a clever little rascal. At that very moment, she looked at him intently and asked if he had noticed the note, for the signature meant that he too was a member of the banquet. At the same moment, she declared that the Duke should also be invited. He was surprised. As she left, she declared that for this reason, everything needed to be carefully checked. A moment later, the young gentleman asked his brother with a joyful smile if everything had worked out, and Rubian declared that everything had worked out. At that very moment, they began to jump for joy. After some time, the maids began preparing, each one making their own contribution. At some points, they thought the scenery was a bit too elaborate. At the same time, the young people closely watched all the preparations from the sidelines. The young lady looked closely at everyone present, as she saw that everyone was trying very hard, and she now felt guilty. Boyd said with a smile that they hadn't had an event like this for a long time, so everyone was excited. At that very moment, the man came closer to them and greeted them with a smile. They happily greeted the chef. He smiled and said that he came to find out what kind of cake Rubian preferred. She was a little surprised, as she knew that it was a party for the Duke. Boyd said that didn't mean they should have left him out. At that very moment, the young lady sheepishly declared that she knew little about desserts. She hardly got to try cake in both lives, so her preferences have nothing to base it on. The chef said with a smile that, since he couldn't decide, he would prepare several cakes so that they could choose. After some time, all preparations were completed. The young lady looked at all the preparations with admiration, as she understood that this really did look like a real banquet. At that very moment, the Duke came in to them and said with a smile that he had long wondered why they had suddenly become quiet, but now he realized that they were busy preparing the beauty in his castle. Without losing a moment, they seized the Duke and declared that he must follow them. A moment later, the Duke was already sitting in the place of honor. But at the same time, he looked at them with bewilderment, as he assumed that the main character was Rubian. He did not understand why he was sitting at the head of the table. Rubian looked at her brother with a smile and offered to tell the whole truth to the Duke. The Duke looked at his son in surprise and asked if he really wanted to tell him something. The boy came closer to his father and, gathering his courage, said from behind that he was very glad that he had returned safe and sound. Boyd stated that he hadn't had a chance to tell his father about it before and wanted to throw him a welcoming party. Looking at the Duke, he thanked him once again for everything he did for them, because he was truly happy that his father was healthy and alive. The Duke was pleasantly surprised by the convenient words, and at the same moment he tenderly adjusted his head and thanked him for this. Rubian ran up to them at that very moment. She looked menacingly at her brother, because he wanted to say something else. At that very moment he shouted and told his father that he was no longer afraid of him, and now he understood perfectly well why his father treated him in this way. Rubian moved closer to her brother and took his arm. He looked at the younger one in surprise, but at that very moment he looked intently at the Duke, for he realized that he had to ask something. Boyd sheepishly asked the Duke if they could all eat together from now on. Rubian looked at the Duke with a satisfied smile, as she wanted him to agree, since the war was already over and there was no longer any hurry. Leviathan looked at his son with a smile, as he saw that he had grown and matured greatly. Leviathan smiled and praised his son for his courage and thanked him for his words. Boyd smiled, embarrassed for the idiot, that it was the younger one's idea, and therefore the Duke had to praise him. She was taken aback as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke saw that they were starting to fool around, so he announced that he had signed the papers for a welcoming party. He looked intently at his son, and at that very moment shouted at him to grab the younger one and make him the star of the banquet. Boyd agreed with a smile, and at that very moment ran after him. She was shocked and screamed that he was just a traitor, but at the same time, she saw how her brother was having fun. At that very moment, the chef came out to them and asked the kids to be careful, and he also invited them to the table. Rubian was a little taken aback, as she had assumed the Duke would be the evening's main guest, but her leg felt like it was her first birthday party. At the same time, the maids skillfully folded small hats and rejoiced. After some time, she woke up because she realized that she had fallen asleep. The Duke, carrying him on his back, said with a smile that he was very tired and fell asleep, but he could understand the boy because he had been organizing the party all day. At that very moment, the Leviathan thanked the boy with a smile for such a holiday. She was in shock and said that she had not done anything special. Then the Duke asked her with a smile if he knew where his room was. She sighed and said that his room was upstairs. The Duke said that if he woke up in the middle of the night, he could come running to him. She stated that she usually did not wake up. The Duke knew it was wonderful, but he said that if he was afraid or bad thoughts started to enter his head, he could come to him. Despite his busy schedule, the Duke began to spend more time with them, at least once a day. And when he was with her, he always brought her something tasty. She was shocked and did not understand why he continued to bother the chef, because she could not eat a whole mountain of desserts. The Duke stated that he himself was crazy about the process. The Duke said that the boy needed to eat more because he was very small. At that very moment, the Leviathan said that he could eat with him for company. She looked at him in surprise and declared that it seemed that he secretly loved sweets. She asked if he would really be working from now on in a place other than his office. Next to her, because he wanted to stuff her with sweets, the Duke said with a smile that it would turn out he was caught. At that very moment, she took the piece of dessert from him and declared that she had confiscated it for the Duke's insolence. The Duke, in turn, looked at Rubian with joy, since he saw that he liked the strawberry cake. At that very moment, the Duke said with a smile that when he had finished eating, they could go to the outbuilding together. She asked in surprise why they needed to go somewhere. The Duke stated that his old man had become too quiet, and that was why he wanted to visit him. She looked at the Duke in surprise and wondered if he was talking about the old Duke, since in the original story, he rarely left the house due to illness. But she knew that he was far from playing the most important role, so she forgot about him. She understood that since he was not the main character, nothing would happen. But a moment later, the young lady heard something. She was taken aback and wondered if they were being attacked by dark creatures. The Duke sighed heavily and asked the baby to just continue eating the cake. He knew that his father would arrive soon. At that very moment, the old man burst into the room and with a shout asked where the new boy was. A moment later, he felt the door fall and shouted that it was an attack. At that very moment, he easily got rid of the door. She was shocked because he was supposed to have stayed home because he was sick. Leviathan was shocked because his father had broken down the door again and scared the child. At that very moment, the man shouted for them to stop all their chatter. He shouted for his son to bring him the boy right away. The Duke looked at his father in bewilderment and stated that the boy was right in front of him. At that moment, the Balrog looked intently at the young lady, and she hurriedly hid behind the Duke. Rubian greeted the old man, trembling with fear. At that very moment, the man asked his son's word what kind of a bug he had brought into the house. She said that it was not so, but at that very moment, he noticed that in front of him was simply a talking bug. Rubian gathered her courage and introduced herself, hoping that he didn't intend to destroy her, as well as the door. At that very moment, the man reached for his axe and shouted at the little one to get out immediately. She was in shock because she realized that he was going to attack her now, so she screamed. But a moment later, she looked at the shiny axe with bewilderment, because a measuring ruler was visible on the handle. At that very moment, the old man declared that the boy in front of him was just above a low-ranking demonic beast. At that moment, he shouted to his son and declared that the boy was disqualified. Leviathan sighed heavily and declared to his father that this was too far off. Rubian shouted at his son that he had asked him to bring a capable knight, not a child. He did not want to listen to his son and shouted that he should send the child back to the capital. Leviathan looked at his father intently and, containing his rage, asked him to lower his tone, as he was frightening the child. For some time the man lectured his son. At that very moment he sighed heavily and told his father not to mumble under his breath, since he did not understand him. The young lady looked at the old man in bewilderment, as she saw that he was very strange. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and wondered if he would really throw her out of the house. She knew that he had accepted the other children without any problems. For this reason, she thought that the same would happen to her. At that very moment, the old man told the boy not to look at him with such puppy eyes, since he had a sinking feeling that he would break from the slightest blow. Leviathan looked at his father intently and declared that he would not determine the boy's future. At that moment, they continued to argue. The poor lady did not want to listen to such things and stopped them, because she did not like that they were arguing because of her. At that very moment, she shouted to her grandfather and declared that he should not throw her out, since she had nowhere to go. She understood that it would be better to die than to return back to the kingdom of magicians. She screamed that she would eat well and would definitely grow up, and that she would not be broken by the blow. The Duke looked at him pitifully. She said with tears in her eyes that she was not that weak, so she asked them not to throw her out. She said that if they got to know her better, they would be surprised. The Duke looked at his father with fury, as he did not understand why he was frightening the child without reason and saying such things. At that very moment, the Duke took the boy away and said that they would go and rest and drink hot chocolate. The man was shocked, as his son was being sarcastic to him. She understood that they couldn't leave, because if this continued, she would really be kicked out. Looking at the old man, she realized that she needed to do something quickly. At that very moment, she hugged the Duke tightly and declared that she did not care what the Lord said, and that she would remain in the house. Rubian screamed that she would live in the house no matter what, while she hugged the Duke tighter. The Lord froze in place from shock, but at the same moment, she shouted that she did not want to part with her uncle. The Duke could not resist and burst out laughing wildly. The man looked closely at his son, and, holding back a smile, said that something was stuck to him. Balrog stated that it seemed that his son had a very naughty little bug attached to him. She looked in surprise at the Duke, who was holding back his laughter. Some time later, the young lady was interviewed for a position as a member of the Siebert family. The Balrog looked menacingly at the boy and asked if he really wanted to stay in the castle so much. Without wasting a moment, the young lady declared that she very much wanted to stay. The man shouted that in that case, he should demonstrate his abilities, be it endurance or fighting skills. She shouted with a smile that she would do everything easily. At that very moment, she realized that she was strong in magic and could demonstrate several tricks, but she knew that she couldn't show them anything because they would expose her, and so she stated that her strong point was her fortitude. The man sighed, because he understood that this was also important. But at that very moment, he shouted that the boy should eat all the desserts right now. After all, he was not such a heartless old man. At that very moment, he slammed the table so hard that the young lady almost fell, but instead jumped into the air. The man shouted that as soon as the boy finished his snack, he would check on him and throw him out of the estate. She was in shock, as she would eventually be kicked out of the castle anyway. A moment later, the man miscalculated his strength and, to his surprise, broke a small table. His companions were also surprised. Rubiane, since she was unable to eat dessert, she wondered if this was a special test of human psychology. At that very moment, the old man shouted to the guards to immediately bring all the cakes that were in the castle. The Duke, at that very moment, with a smile, handed Rubiane a small piece of cake and announced that he needed to leave, as he had received a notification about the monsters. He quietly told the boy that he was very sorry to have to leave them alone, but he also said that the boy could get along with the old man if he followed him around like a little dog. At that very moment, the Duke said goodbye to Rubiane, but she understood that he had given stupid advice. Balrog asked the boy if he was really passionate, and since monsters often came to them, and such a roof as he was a piece of cake for them. At that very moment, she sighed heavily and declared that she was scared. Rubiane, looking at the old man, still asked him to leave her. At that very moment, she attacked him with a cute puppy dog look. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if her look hadn't worked. At that very moment, she used another puppy dog look attack. Unfortunately, the man gave in. At that very moment, he shouted that if the boy was really scared, he could stay, because he was not a scoundrel who drove out the one who was trembling like an aspen leaf. At that very moment, the young lady finally decided to launch a third attack with her puppy dog eyes. Looking at the old man, she said that she wanted to stay in the castle next to them. He could not stand it and accepted defeat at that very moment. Rubiane understood perfectly well that after this, she would definitely not be kicked out. Balrog looked at him in surprise, as he spoke very sweetly, and therefore he doubted that it was a boy in front of him. At the same time, he did not understand why he wore such big things. The maid said that the tailor was on a business trip, and they would only take measurements in a few days. The man was puzzled, since the boy would have to walk like a potato sack for several days. They argued among themselves for several minutes, and the young lady did not understand how the old man could be so cruel. She braced herself, as she wanted to deliver a verbal blow to him. But at that very moment, she froze, because she heard her friend. Balrog looked at the boy in surprise, as he did not understand where he had suddenly run off to, but she said that she urgently needed to go to the toilet. As she ran away, she shouted that she would be back soon. Balrog froze in shock, as he did not expect this. He was shocked and wondered if the boy really had such a sudden urge. The maid looked at the young master with bewilderment, as she realized that he had run to his room and not to the restroom. She assumed that the boy could not stand the Lord's anger. He was surprised, but she tried to explain the situation to him. Northerners became squires in knighthood from a very early age. The parents did not want a weak child, and through strict training, they became noble knights, ready to stand up for the defense of the North. It seemed to him that the child whose birth his son brought would be the same, but he turned out to be soft and gentle. After the maid's explanation, he realized that he had frightened the child, but a moment later, he realized that there was nothing to worry about, because such a child had no place in the North. At that very moment, the maid said that the little boy was very cute. The Lord supported her, because he saw that he was terribly cute, and he wanted to sit on him. She screamed that he was not only cute, but also brave. Lord was shocked, because he did not understand how a little bug could be brave. Hazel stated that a few minutes ago he was confidently talking to the Lord. The Lord understood that this was so, because his other grandchildren were always crying and avoiding him. Hazel stated that perhaps from now on the young master would begin to avoid him. Meanwhile, the young lady Stoya was quietly listening to her friend in her room. A moment later, she was taken aback and asked her friend if he was sure of his words. Khalid said that King Arkan learned not only that she was alive, but also that she was in the empire. Khalid told his mistress that the king had sent pursuers to the continent. After hearing this, the young lady was consumed by panic. She was breathing heavily and could not utter a word. But at the same time, she heard her friend calling her. Khalid tried to calm her down and told her that he was already on his way to her. Trembling with fear, she said that she did not want to be taken back to the kingdom. Khalid said that she should stick to the duke. He also said that if she had not left him, she would have been safe. She asked him not to be angry, as she had no other choice. But he stated that he could not be angry with her at all. Khalid told her that there was no mana in this area, so the bloodhounds could do little. She understood that this was true. Khalid asked her to just wait a little while, and he would be with her soon. She thanked him for such words. Rubian immediately pulled herself together, knowing she needed to prepare. She would like clarity as to why the Duke died. At the same time, she assumed that his death was influenced by monsters, since they were one of the many enemies in the north. She recalled the approximate time of the Duke's death, so she knew that he still had a few years of respite. But, unfortunately, these were just her assumptions. But the young lady understood that she still had to do everything in her power to prevent a catastrophe. After a moment, she finally released all her magical power. Viziria, the sea, where countless magical formulas were intricately intertwined. The sea that was called the wisdom of the world, truth and order, or simply the blessing of the earth. She taught her every magic circle in this world, and thanks to her, even with a small supply of innate mana, she could live as a mage. At that very moment, she was asked if she really needed help. Rubian said with a smile that this was indeed the case. She said that she would definitely help her, and at that very moment, she presented a small but beautiful star to her friend. The lady realized that it was with something like this that she could protect the Duke. After some time, she ran into the room to her brother and called him with a scream. He was taken aback because Junior scared him. Rubian said she came to him to ask if he had any cards, but she asked what he wrote in his diary. Rubian said with a smile that it seemed like he was writing something about her, and that's why she only wanted to take a look with one eye. But he shouted that he wouldn't give anything to his brother. The young lady ended up losing, but she still asked if he had a card. Boyd asked the younger one if he had met his grandfather and if everything had gone well. She sighed and said that the grandfather was something else. Boyd smiled and told the younger one that maybe he already knew once, but the boy had already warned his younger one to be a little careful. Boyd, shaking with recollection, said his grandfather once said he would train him and his brother, then dragged them to the northern mountains in the middle of the night. After riding off, she quietly prepared for bed for some time. The Duke came to the baby and asked with a smile why he was not asleep yet. She asked in surprise if he would really work in her room. The Duke smiled and stated that he only wanted to check whether he was asleep or not, and then return back. Leviathan asked his companion how his stomach was, because he heard that he suddenly ran to the toilet. She was taken aback, but at the same moment she said with a smile that everything was fine, because she hadn't felt bad to begin with. Leviathan said that his father had teased the boy, and that was why he felt ill. She sighed and stated that it was not so, because she just needed to go to the bathroom. She asked if the Lord didn't like her. Leviathan sighed and stated that they needed to remove the passage leading to the northern building. Rubian asked the Duke if he would kick her out if her uncle continued to insist that she leave. The Duke said with a smile that, of course, he would not throw her out, but she was glad to hear something like that. He looked at her intently and stated that he had already told her that no one could force her to do something she couldn't stand. She was puzzled because she felt some kind of strange feeling. She saw that he was kind to her, and her heart was tingling about it. The Duke looked at her intently, and at the same moment he reached out to her. Rubian saw in front of her an unfriendly, rude Duke, who looked at her every time as if she were a jewel. She began to fear the moment when her lies would come to light. She understood that when something like this happened, this kindness would also evaporate. After some time, the young lady was sleeping quietly in her bed. The Duke looked at her with a tender smile, but after a moment he sighed heavily as he remembered his words and her reaction. He understood that the boy was simply worried that he might ask him to leave. Moments later, the Duke reached out to the boy as he heard him return and tremble with fear. The Duke noticed a moment later that the boy was crying. Leviathan quickly picked up the boy and tried to calm him down, but he also heard quiet muttering. The Duke was puzzled, as he did not understand what was tormenting the little boy so. He wanted the boy to tell him everything, but he understood that he would have to wait a long time. The young lady knelt quietly before her enemy. The man looked at his beloved seventh daughter with a smile. He looked at her with a tender smile, and holding out his hands, declared that because of him she had suffered a lot, and that was why his heart was breaking. But at that very moment, he grabbed her hand, and with a fierce grin, declared that she must be extremely careful when she caught the black magician, and she must make sure that he was delivered alive. He said that this was the reason they were waging war, and that under no circumstances should he be allowed to fall into the clutches of the people from the continent. He knew that the man must not fall into the hands of Duke Siebert. At that very moment, he heard her indistinct muttering. Rubian looked at him with a fierce grin and declared that she had disobeyed his orders. But at least she had defeated him. He was shocked and didn't understand what she was talking about, but at that very moment, she pushed him away. He was furious and shouted, calling her. But it was all in vain. After some time, the young lady woke up in a warm bed. She looked into the distance with joy, as she had finally had a good night's sleep. But after a moment, she looked at the bed linen in surprise, as it was uncomfortable. At that very moment, she was taken aback, as she saw her brother in front of her, and asked what he was doing in her room. Rubbing his eyes, he said that he had come to play cards. She asked in surprise if he had really come to her place that very morning to play cards. He said that was true, but changed his mind. At the same moment, leaving, he said that he was going to the restroom, but for some reason ended up in the younger one's room. She looked after him in surprise and wondered if he would just leave. At that very moment, she turned her attention to the Duke and asked if he really wanted to play cards so early in the morning. The Duke stated that he simply liked the sofa. She asked in bewilderment if he really liked it so much that he fell asleep on it. The Duke stated that it was so, but it didn't matter now. He looked closely at the boy and declared that if he saw anything strange today, he should pretend that he had not noticed anything. Rubian looked around the manor and called for the butler in surprise. The butler looked at the young gentleman with a smile. She wondered if she just had to pretend she hadn't noticed the old gentleman. Adolf reported that the man was now very worried about having treated the young gentleman badly, because he had to run away from the room. She said she just had a stomachache, but no one believed her. At the same moment, she said she hoped the old gentleman would go with her. The Lord could not stand it, and at that very moment, he shouted in embarrassment that the boy was angry with him. They looked at each other in surprise. Rubian, looking at the old man, she wondered if this was some kind of new test on his part. The old man approached the boy and said that he had mixed up his words and wanted to say something else. She couldn't help but laugh, as it was the first time she had seen an adult so nervous. She said that she was surprised and not angry. He looked at her in surprise and asked if he didn't hate him. Rubian understood that everything was the other way around and that the old man didn't like her. The man was shocked because he didn't understand how one could not love such a little brat. At the same time, the butler watched them with a smile. The Lord was shocked and did not understand where such a cute boy came from. She was shocked and screamed that his beard was very itchy. A moment later, she sighed heavily and declared that she was very ticklish. Balrog said with a smile that the boy now had a beautiful hairpin, but his clothes were like a sack of potatoes. But he was still very cute. The Lord looked at the butler in surprise and asked if his son had really given him the keys to the eastern room. The butler sighed and sadly stated that everything was so. She looked at the Lord in surprise, as she did not understand why he was sad. Visiting the Northern Duke's domain sounded quite daunting, and she expected something like that. But when she saw people who were glowing with happiness and talking about their little victories, she was very surprised. Everyone greeted the Lord with joy and treated him every time. He accepted the wonderful gifts with a smile, but still said that he didn't need anything else. She saw that he was giving orders to his knights, and that he seemed to her like a grandfather beloved by everyone. At that very moment, the old man grabbed the boy and declared that it was time for them to run, otherwise they would be stuck forever in such a place. Rubian looked at the old man with a smile, because she knew that when they first entered the city, it was the same, and so she understood that everyone loved the ducal family very much. A few minutes later, they visited the boutique. The lady approached the sweet miss with a smile and asked what kind of clothes she liked. Rubian, in turn, intended to continue to hide her identity, so she declared that she was a boy. The lady was taken aback, as she mistook the boy for a girl, but she asked for forgiveness. At that very moment, the Lord declared that the boy needed to eat more to grow up big, but she shouted at him not to laugh at her. She was almost afraid that she had been discovered. But nevertheless, she saw a fixed gaze, madam, and Madame said that it was all very strange. The lady could not understand why. Looking at the young gentleman, she saw a girl in a beautiful dress. Meanwhile, the young lady, with a joyful smile, led the Escuria through the Duke's mysterious possessions. She was well aware that the Duke had a powerful weapons industry in his possession. This land generously endowed the craftsmen with such high-quality minerals that their fame thundered throughout the continent. Who we are already, the flames of war that engulfed the continent involuntarily fanned their deeds, and the heart where weapons were born beat in the largest forge. The Lord, in turn, without wasting a minute, led the young master to the forge. The man looked at the Lord in bewilderment and asked if he really had a late child, or something like that. The Lord was shocked and shouted at his friend not to talk such nonsense and not to smoke in the presence of the child. The man was taken aback, and looking at the boy, offered to work with a hammer as an apology. He said that if the boy wanted to start from the very beginning, he could begin to melt iron. The Lord was shocked as his comrade was forcing the child to work. At that moment, he shouted and demanded a sword from his comrade. Balrog sighed, as he saw that his comrade was crazier than he thought, but he understood that it was dangerous for the boy to be in such a place. Rubian said with a smile that in that case she would go and look for something interesting. The Lord shouted that the knights were outside, and she should stay close to them. She ran away with a smile and said that she would return soon. A moment later, the Lord began to talk to his comrade, giving him clear instructions. A few minutes later, the young lady came out into the street and saw her friend. She addressed him formally, and at the same moment, he stated that it should call him senior. At the same time, he was a little upset because the younger gentleman did not go into the knight's barracks. She looked at him with bewilderment, since she did not understand why she had to go there. At that moment, he realized that he had to let go of the subject and asked the boy where he wanted to go. After some time, they entered a beautiful shop where there were many beautiful stones. She recently discovered a shop where magical stones were sold. Rubian knew perfectly well that magic stones were beautiful, cheap, and cool. Magic stones were mined in magical mines or received as rewards for defeating demonic beasts. The best stones were obtained for the victory over powerful creatures. Magical instruments were created from magic stones. She knew that the Duke's estate was often ravaged by monsters, so many high-quality stones were mined here. The kingdom of magicians imported them, turning them into magical tools, and they resold them throughout the continent at a huge profit. Lion, looking at the beautiful stone, asked the young gentleman if he really needed something so useless. He saw that the color was beautiful, but the stone was too heavy for jewelry. He asked what about a gemstone of that color. She said with a smile that she needed this very stone. At that very moment, the knight gave the stone to the boy. Rubian knew that the kingdom of magicians kept the use of magic stones a closely guarded secret, and here they were considered just decorations. However, she was the only one in the kingdom who knew how to create barriers using magic stones. The kingdom of the mages is protected by an ancient magical barrier, an artifact that was long forgotten, and thanks to this, it has maintained a reputation for being an obscene fortress for millennia. Rubian knew of an ancient magic circle that could be used to create a similar artifact. Rubian was happy because she understood that she would buy a lot of magic stones and cover the entire castle with protection. But after a moment, she wondered what she should do. Looking at the beautiful stones, she declared that she had no money at all. Everyone present was taken aback by the shock. Balrog asked angrily what he didn't have. She looked at him in surprise, as she hadn't realized when he had managed to approach. Lion angrily asked the boy if the Duke had not given him pocket money. At that very moment, the Lord could not stand it and shouted at the boy to immediately say what he wanted. Lion held the old man and said that they would buy him everything. Rubian, in turn, was taken aback, since she had not asked for such reactions. A few minutes later, the Duke entered their shop and asked with bewilderment why they were making noise, since they could be heard even from outside. The Lord could not stand it and began to shout at his son that he had not left the little one any money, and at the same time he stamped his feet because he could not buy for himself what he wanted. The young lady was shocked and screamed that she had not stamped her feet at all. At that very moment, the Duke approached the younger one, and kneeling down, he called him with a smile. Leviathan asked the boy if he really needed something. Rubian was taken aback and stated that it was true, but she didn't need it right now. They all surrounded her, and with bright smiles, asked her what she really wanted. At that very moment, she pointed to the entire counter and declared that she needed all the stones. But after her words, she asked shyly if she wanted too much. She said that they could buy her at least a few stones. At that very moment, the Duke told his knight to invite the shopkeeper out for a walk, as he intended to buy it. Rubian was shocked, but a few minutes later, she was already holding the documents for the store in her hands. The Lord looked at her with a smile and asked if this was all she wanted, since she had not dreamed of being rich. Meanwhile, they stood and chatted pleasantly with each other, not noticing anything around them. But a moment later, the young lady was taken aback as the man abruptly pulled her to the side. He saved her from impending danger. She was thrilled because he was just incredibly cool. But a moment later, the Lord fell to the ground. She saw that he was in unbearable pain, and she called him, but it was all in vain. After some time, people offered their deepest apologies to the master, since the horse had been stung by a bee and had therefore gone mad. The Duke sighed heavily and asked Rubian if he was scared. She stated that she was fine, because the Lord had saved her. But she was still very worried about the Lord, while the Duke asked the boy not to worry about the old man. But she was puzzled, because she remembered how the Lord sighed heavily and spoke nastily about his decrepit body. She knew that after what happened, he never looked her in the eyes again. After a while, she happily jumped onto her bed as she was tired after a long day. She spoke with a smile about her maid and where she had been. Hazel immediately opened the small box and was surprised to see beautiful herbs. Rubian said with a smile that many of them grew even in winter, and the Duke allowed her to plant flowers in the garden when it got warmer. So she was puzzled, because the Duke spent a lot of money on her, but the maid assured that he did not even feel how much he spent. She saw all the gifts, and while talking to the maid, noticed that she spoke like a duke. But after a moment, the young lady came to her senses, as she realized that she had forgotten something important. She asked the maid to cut her clothes. Hazel, with a satisfied smirk, declared that she was a master when it came to spicy food. That same evening, the butler asked the Lord if he should prepare more painkillers, but the Lord saw no point, since the painkillers did not work. At the same time, he was glad that the boy returned home safely, but the Lord also asked the butler if he had given him pocket money. The butler said with a smile that he had done everything as expected and filled the bag with gems. He saw the boy's embarrassed and joyful smile as he said that such a thing was not necessary. The butler saw that the boy was a little stunned, but he still liked everything. At that very moment, Adolf approached the Lord because he saw that he was feeling bad. He wanted to help with something, but the old man could not stand it and shouted at the butler to leave immediately. The Lord was angry with himself as he was overcome by illness, and with his decrepit body, he could not even protect the little boy. Adolf bowed low, and at that very moment, hastened to leave. For some time the old man sat quietly in his bed. One stronger than Balrog, his mere presence on the battlefield could shake the enemy's morale. But one day in battle, he received a serious injury which led to permanent problems with his leg. He never showed it, but the pains began to come to him more often. Soon, a war between people and demons broke out, but he was unable to fight. This left a deep scar on the pride of the Northern Knight. Adolf knew that from then on, he had become withdrawn and more cruel. A moment later, the butler froze in surprise, as the younger gentleman, looking at him, asked if he could visit the Grand Duke. A few minutes later, the young lady came into the Lord's room. He heard someone's presence and became angry. He was furious because he had told Adolf to leave, and he had dared to ignore his order. At that very moment, Yulia Edie looked at the butler and told him to be quieter, otherwise they could wake up the Lord. Adolf smiled and declared that the old man would not wake up even if his junior master dragged him. A moment later, she announced that she had brought the ointment with the cloth, because it was supposed to ease the Lord's pain. She also told that she had made a fine for the things she had bought at the market. Adolf remembered that the little master's parents were doctors. She sheepishly agreed as she had already spoken about such a small lodge before. Adolf asked the boy in surprise if he knew that the Lord had problems with their knees. She said that it was so, and he was surprised. Rubian stated that she knew it because of the sound of his footsteps, as they were strange, as if he was pulling up one leg. And even earlier in the village, while dodging a horse, he stumbled and fell on his right leg. She said that, for this reason, she assumed that his leg hurt, but it turned out that he was trying to hide it, so she pretended not to know anything. She was well aware of the fact that if this continued, the situation could get worse. Adolf smiled and stated that it seemed that this was the reason she made the ointment. At that very moment, she began to run around the knee and blow on it, as she knew that his knee was burning because of the medicine. Adolf looked intently at his master, for he saw that his lips were trembling. He served the Duke for decades, but he only saw him cry twice. When the former Duchess died, he cried a lot, and also when his granddaughter was stillborn, he did not spare tears. When the whole family was overwhelmed with grief, the dark beasts invaded the territory. The Lord wanted to fight in place of his son, but his body did not obey at all, so he was unable to participate. Thus, he called his body useless. The young lady looked at the old man for a while and wondered if she could grow as big as him. At that very moment, she smiled and declared that she would become stronger. Adolf asked the young gentleman, with a smile, if he really wanted to become like the Lord. Adolf looked at his master with a satisfied smile, for he was glad that the 3 tears in his life were from joy and not from grief. Meanwhile, the man, sitting on the throne, quietly called his child. He was furious because she had escaped from his embrace again. He cried quietly for a while. A moment later, he announced that she had taken possession of the physical body this time. He knew that flesh and blood always left traces, so he wanted to send more people to search. Looking at his subordinate, he declared that they needed to find the child at any cost. He knew that they needed her to summon the warlock. He knew that she was an archipelago that had adopted the wisdom of Viseria, and he also knew that she was a gem that had been stolen by him. Meanwhile, the young lady was happily processing all the stones she had. She sighed heavily, as it took forever for the stone's power to activate. A moment later, she finished all her preparations, but heard someone come to her. Rubian was happy because she knew that her grandfather was already used to eating with her. Boyd ran away from her with a smile, but said that the desserts were already ready. After some time, the young lady sat surrounded by handsome men, and the old man happily treated her to this and taught her at the same time. Rubian was shocked and screamed that she simply could not eat under such conditions. At that very moment, Rubian ran away from the old man and declared that if he continued to mock her, she would leave. He said that it wasn't true, because he was only offering her a bribe to get his knee checked again. At that very moment, the young lady became embarrassed and shouted at him to stop laughing. She knew he was conscious, and yet she remembered blowing, so that no one would suspect healing magic. The man said with a smile that his knee was hurting again, and that she, their brilliant healer, should look at it. She screamed and called him Duke, but he said with a smile that she could call him grandfather. Leviathan at the same time watched them closely. At that very moment, he could not stand it and climbed into his father's ward. Leviathan looked at the father with a stern and menacing look and told him to stop torturing the child, because he had already received his medicine. The old man said that he was not making fun of her at all, but he felt much better after the little bug had patched him up. Leviathan told his father that he should just say words of gratitude. The Lord sighed heavily and declared that he would not mock him anymore, so the boy should call him grandfather. After some time, they were left alone, as the Lord wanted to talk to his son. The Lord asked if the boy had received their family name, but the Duke stated that he had not yet been registered. The man was shocked because he did not expect this. At that very moment, he simply fell to the ground with a crash. Leviathan declared that adoption was a responsible step, and the boy's opinions also had to be taken into account. The Lord asked his son in a trembling voice, "Are you really saying that the little one won't be with them forever?" After all, the mere thought of his disappearance made him tremble. Leviathan told him beforehand that he had read between the lines of the letters. They argued about adoption for a while, and Lord told his son that when his wife returned, they should discuss everything. At the same time, he told his son that he should not let the boy go. He screamed and demanded that his son do everything possible to keep the boy in their house. The Duke said he couldn't leave it to the boy to decide, but the man was sure his son could raise the issue. A few days later, the young lady finished all the preparations for the magic stones. She knew that her maid was often absent due to the enormous amount of work, while grandfather was busy drawing models of new weapons. Her brother was learning fencing, and the Duke was, as always, simply busy. Thanks to this, she had plenty of time to remain unnoticed. But she still knew that with the help of magic stones, it was possible to create a barrier. But she knew that this was an extremely ineffective use. In comparison, they could eat raw food, but if they were cooked, they became tastier. And in the same way, with stones, it is much more profitable to make magical tools from them. Rubian bound the mana that was in the air, the one that was in the magic stones, so the barrier became permanent, and she did not have to constantly fill them with magical power. She wanted to make a shield that would protect this place for a long time, a shield that would be able to detect and stop the invasion. At that very moment, she sighed heavily, as she knew that the arrangement of stones was a very tricky process. She knew that she needed to cover the castle with stones, but she didn't know where exactly to hide them. She supposed she could have told the knights that she wanted to be a patroller for a while, but she understood that the knights could become angry with her and take her for a spy. At that very moment, she cast aside all her thoughts and was taken aback as she heard the Duke's voice. He stated that he was entering the room. She was in shock as her eyes remained red due to the long use of magic. The Duke nevertheless entered the room and asked what the boy was doing, that he didn't even open the door. He saw that the boy had red eyes. She was taken aback and wondered if he had seen everything. At that very moment, the Duke approached the boy and asked if he had worked so hard that the blood vessels in his eyes had burst. She was taken aback and said that she had been reading the book and could not tear herself away. At the same time, she thanked the heavens that she had managed to change the color of her eyes quickly. The Duke picked up the young lady and said that Rubian had been sitting in his room for too long, and therefore they needed to take a walk. She was surprised, as she knew that he was always busy. She wanted to know why he came to her. The Duke asked in surprise if he really needed a reason for him to see him. After some time, the young lady was ready for a walk outside, but she realized that he was behaving very strangely. It seemed to her that he was completely broken. But after some time, they still went out for a walk, and the young lady happily ran around the yard. She enjoyed the beautiful weather. At the same time, the Duke asked the boy to watch his step, because he knew that he could fall. The Duke looked at the boy in surprise and asked what book had interested him so much that he couldn't tear himself away from it, and he said with a smile that she had taken one from the library. The Duke told the boy that since he enjoyed reading so much, he could hire him a tutor. At the same moment, the young lady declared that she would like to wield a sword. Leviathan looked at the boy with surprise, as he did not expect this, but she stated that she would like to become stronger, just like the people of the north. She understood that if she joined the knightly order, she would be able to go beyond the estate, because her little brother walked with the knights and inspected the castle walls. She understood that this way she could determine where it would be better to place the magic stones. The Duke looked closely at his ward and stated that he agreed with him, but if he had any other ideas, he should tell them. She said with a smile that she loved to study and would try hard. At that very moment, Duke timidly began to talk to the boy about him staying. She looked at him with a smile, as he was quietly muttering something, and she did not understand. But at that very moment, he threw all his thoughts away and declared that first they needed to find a teacher. She said that she could train with her brother, but the Duke declared that it would be difficult for her to catch up with him. The Duke proudly said that his son was already at an advanced level in the elementary academy. She suggested that he could study with the knights. The Duke knew that the knights would be lenient towards her, but once he had made his decision, he needed to prepare properly. She knew that every time she visited the knights, they looked at her menacingly, and at the same time she felt their pressure. Rubian saw their grins, and at the same time, they said that the boy should come to them more often, and each time they wanted to feed her. At that very moment, she began to tremble violently as their glances frightened her. She asked if anyone had joined the knights, but the Duke claimed his son had joined several years ago and was the last. She was surprised that no new recruits had. The newest and youngest member, after long years of severe chivalry. Just from these words, she already understood that she would be a punching bag for them. At that very moment, she declared that she was taking back her words. The Duke said with a smile that a man never goes back on his word, and at the same time he wished her luck. She was shocked and realized that she was doomed. After some time, the young man happily showed off in front of the new recruit, as he was incredibly glad that he had come to them. Each of the knights showed what he was capable of, and at the same time they said that they were eagerly awaiting the day when he would come to them. She was shocked, because they were glowing with happiness just because she came to them, but she understood that this was too much on their part, but she could not do anything about it. Rubian looked at the young master intently and stated that their order valued only merit, so they did not use honorifics within the order. At that very moment, she looked intently at the captain and declared that she had no questions. He noticed that the boy even had his own uniform, which was very cute. So, at that very moment, he declared that they should start their regular training. At that very moment, he announced that the boy had to run several laps at the training ground. She was shocked, as the training ground was vast. Oberon stated that they have a separate area for children. A moment later, the young lady began to run, while the young man watched her closely. Oberon immediately looked at the boy and declared that he must now swing the wooden sword. Since it was very dangerous, a mini version was prepared for him. She immediately took a beautiful mini sword and began to carry out the task. Oberon shouted that horsemanship was essential for a knight. At the same moment, he declared to his subordinate that he would be the horse for their new recruit. A moment later, the young lady was riding a makeshift horse. She was in confusion for a while. At this point, the knights were arguing with each other about who would be the next one to ride the recruit. She was shocked and wondered if this was just a game with a small child. Oberon, looking at the new recruit, said that he had done a good job, but tomorrow they would go to inspect the castle walls. She was surprised and glad that they would go to inspect the castle so soon. It was not expected at all that it would happen so quickly, but at that very moment, the man declared that the desire to do something was the right attitude, and therefore the captain would be happy. Oberon said that, being a proud knight, they must train and maintain dignity so as not to tarnish the Duke's name. At that moment, the young lady asked what would happen if the commander disgraced his knights. The young man looked at the recruits in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. She pointed the young man in the direction and stated that the commander had been sleeping under the tree for a long time. After some time, the Duke asked the boy with a smile if he had had a good time, but she said that she had not played at all, but trained and ran around the training ground and waved her sword. At the same time, she did not understand why he decided to work in such a place. The Duke stated that while he was in the office, he hardly saw him. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Leviathan looked intently at his companion and declared that he should be filling his head with such things. But he also lost track of why the boy was so inspired. She joyfully shouted that they would go to inspect the castle walls tomorrow, and she was very happy, as she had been waiting for something like this for a long time. At that very moment, the Duke came closer to the boy and called him. He looked at the boy with a sad look and asked since when he wanted to go there. Durza said that he would have taken him if he had only told him. Rubian was taken aback and stated that she simply did not want to disturb the Duke. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she was holding back, because like her parents, she was irritated. She said that was not the case, but she lied again about her origin. It is true that she never asked her parents, or rather the Magic King, for anything, and with age, she realized that she had nothing to do there and no one cared about her desires. A moment later, she felt sick, because it seemed to her that her memories were false, as if no one had forcibly stitched them together. The Duke saw the little boy's condition, so without wasting a minute, he hugged him tightly. He asked the boy to calm down and not think about such things. He reproached himself for stirring up the young man's bad memories, and it was his fault, because he was inattentive. The Duke repeated that he was very sorry, and at the same time the young lady felt calm. After some time, the young ladies happily examined the castle walls, while the Lord asked the youth to be careful not to fall. At that moment, she asked her grandfather with a smile what kind of bells were hanging in the distance. He said that they rang in case of danger, for example, during a monster invasion, and they were spread along the entire wall. At that very moment, the young lady's expression changed, And since she had found what she had been looking for a long time, she understood that if she could place the stones along the entire length of the wall, she could create the perfect barrier. Rubian wondered if she should add additional features, like making the bells ring automatically when an intruder arrived. She knew that if she could combine them with her mana, she would be the first to know. At that very moment, the old man lifted the boy up and declared that he had very strange interests. At the same time, he noticed that the boy was light as a feather. She hugged her grandfather and said that it was not so, and she grew up every day. At the same time, the Lord asked with a smile if it was true. At that very moment, a knight ran up to them and announced that there had been a sudden attack of monsters. The Lord was shocked because he knew they had dealt with the monsters a couple of days ago, so he thought they had gone quiet for a while. At that very moment, he looked at the boy and declared that they were just little monsters, and he didn't need to worry. Balrog, looking at the knight, told him exactly what needed to be done. The young lady looked at them in surprise, as she saw that they reacted quickly to such a situation. But at that very moment, another knight came up to them and called the elder. Without wasting a single minute, he announced that the monsters had been eliminated, leaving everyone frozen in shock and surprise. The knight reported that according to the report, shortly after the monsters attacked, someone appeared who destroyed them. He was taken aback and stated that the young man looked like a small youth. The Lord was shocked and immediately shouted at the man he had repaired, as he wanted to know more. He was shocked and did not understand how they could confuse the shadow of a monster with a person. In turn, she just laughed. But for some reason, her friend immediately came to her mind. A moment later, she was taken aback because she saw a little squirrel. Rubian picked up the squirrel and asked if he was afraid of chaos. She looked at the little squirrel with a joyful smile as it was caressing her, while she did not pay any attention to the extraneous chaos. She happily played with the squirrel, while everyone else was sorting out the situation. After some time, the maid told her master that some time ago a huge incident occurred, and since the monsters suddenly appeared from the servants' shock, they almost opened the underground passage. She stated that the Lord was very worried, but she herself was puzzled, because something like this happened when they were all present at the inspection. Rubian smiled and declared that, unfortunately, monsters don't warn of their arrival. The maid knew this was true, but still, anxiety is a human factor. Hazel looked at the young gentleman with a smile and stated that she would let him know when dinner was ready. For a while, the young lady was left alone with her thoughts. She wondered how she could place the magic stones into the bells on the wall. No matter how much she thought about it, she came to the conclusion that she could not do without help, but she could not ask for help directly. Rubian sighed heavily, as she knew that if she had an assistant, everything would be much easier. But a moment later, she put all her thoughts aside as she heard some sound. She looked in surprise in the direction where the sound was coming from and was taken aback because she saw that very same squirrel. After some time, the young lady ran after the beautiful, cute squirrel with a joyful smile. She guessed that her friend was waiting for her in the forest. In turn, she obediently followed the squirrel for some time, and after a few minutes, she was finally convinced of her assumptions and saw her friend. She looked at him with a smile, as she realized that it was he who had made the noise at the wall. Khalid looked at his master with a joyful smile and greeted her. They met on the battlefield. Then she did not yet realize that she was inside a novel. She understood that she should not have been so careless, since he could turn out to be a high-ranking dark creature. But, unfortunately, she could not pass by a lonely child, who, to his regret, was in a deep cave. At that very moment, she asked him how he ended up in such a place. He sighed heavily and stated that he did not know the answer to her question. She asked if he was going to leave because it was cold in the cave. He looked at her puzzled and said that he couldn't just leave on his own accord. Khalid, looking at the unknown guest, said that she looked like a magician and could determine how complex the formula for sealing the shackle was. Rubian said she thought it would be quite difficult to solve. She said with a smile that she was not good at such things, but she still managed to help him. She looked at him in surprise for a moment. At the same time, the young lady was very happy, and he, in turn, also looked at her with tenderness and joy. At that very moment, she flew towards him with the speed of lightning and struck him. At the same time, she was angry as she asked him to stop blocking her. He smiled and said that everything was fine, and asked if she could have warned him before the attack, as he involuntarily tensed up. He asked her if she had a bump on her head, but all he heard in response was a drawn-out groan. Khalid looked at her with a smile and said that it was many years ago. He did not understand why she was raising this topic again. She was shocked, because she realized that he had blocked her after all. Khalid looked at her with bewilderment and stated that he was just tense. She was furious, since he himself said that he blocked her. At that very moment, he sighed heavily and asked the master what she was doing in such a place. Khalid said with a smile that he was interested to know what she had been doing since leaving him, and even faking her own death. She sighed heavily as she realized that he was very angry. At that very moment, the young man reached out to her and declared that she should no longer run away, because he had finally managed to find her. Rubian looked closely at her comrade, as she realized that he was more irritated than she thought. He looked at her intently and stated that he had wanted to ask her something else since arriving. She looked at him expectantly, and at that very moment, he inquired about her clothes, as she was dressed as a boy. He said with a smile that surely the Duke was not so hopeless as to dress her like that. Rubian said with a smile that it was the result of a misunderstanding. He laughed, but immediately declared that she needed to leave with him. Rubian quickly covered his mouth with her hands and said that he should stop bar-chatting. She did not understand how he managed to use magic and deal with the dark creatures. She shouted that if someone had grabbed him, everything would not have gone according to plan. The young man was taken aback for a moment and froze. At the same moment, he excitedly asked if he was really supposed to just stand there and watch as the monsters surrounded her. He stated that his body moved on its own. Ever since she released the young man from the cave, he had always followed her, and in addition, he had given her an oath of allegiance, and now she could completely control him. In fact, he became her servant. Until the end of the contract, he insisted on this, despite the fact that the conditions were completely unequal. Rubian smiled and said that she understood everything and thanked him for not stopping looking for her. But at the same moment, she asked how long he was going to hold her hand. The young man let go of it, embarrassed. He looked at her with a smile and said that she should not say that she had already forgotten about his oath, because he was the only one who could protect her. She sighed and asked him to stop risking his own life. At the same moment, she stated that she had always envied him, seeing his ability, since he could tame cute animals. Khalid Bel was her complete opposite. He possessed such a level of mana that not even all magical items could suppress it. His ability allowed him to temporarily subjugate the souls of living beings and turn them into his companions. However, he avoided dark creatures, claiming that they destroyed his magical power. He also did not call upon a human soul, so he used his abilities only on animals. Khalid looked menacingly at his friend and said that she did not need to change the subject. He also stated that the Magic King did not yet know that she was in such a place. At that very moment, he asked her if she really disliked his proposal that much. He said he had continued to follow her around even after she had deliberately left. He wanted to know if she really intended to leave him again. She said that was not the case at all. At the same time, the young man said that he felt terrible when she disappeared, because in an instant he stopped feeling her magical energy, and everyone kept saying that the magicians who went to the canyon were dead. He asked her angrily if she knew what it was like for him to see their bodies. At that very moment, she declared that no one had died and that she had created those bodies. He was taken aback, as he didn't expect this, but she stated that destroying the core meant they would no longer be able to use magic and their lifespan would be shortened, but they didn't care, so she simply smashed their cores and let them escape. Rubian sighed and stated that the opportunity had come unexpectedly, so she had not had time to tell him everything, and therefore she asked for forgiveness, because she had intended to contact him after settling in the duchy. At that very moment, he stated that in that case, she should have made her own corpse more realistic. Poe did not understand why only she was exposed. At that moment, he asked in surprise if she had done it on purpose, to protect others from suspicion and to attract the most attention to herself. He sighed heavily because he understood that she wanted to help them, but he didn't understand whether it was necessary to go that far. She just smiled and said nothing in response. Khalid looked menacingly at his girlfriend and declared that he also needed to think about his next plan. A moment later, she stated with a smile that his mana reserves were astonishing, but she did not understand how such a man could end up tied up in a cave. He sighed and stated that he did not remember everything. He supposed that perhaps someone had stabbed him in the back while he was working. She sighed as she remembered that he had been a mercenary before they met. She knew that since he was an orphan, he didn't have a last name, so he simply made up a name that was required for the mission. Khalid looked at his friend with a smile and declared that the reason was not so important. After all, he was going to find the traitors and take revenge on them. She smiled and said that he would be able to overcome everything, and she would root for him. She knew that he had been very determined before. At the same time, she understood the truth and the reason for this determination, because he was the main character of the second part of the novel. At the end of part 1 of the novel, the Leviathan died, and in part 2, the reader was introduced to the new propagandist Khalid. He escaped from the cave where he was imprisoned, and later his main story began. After some time, he finally learned the reason why he was locked up and swore to take revenge on his enemy, plunging his sword into the ruined ground. It was a retelling of Chapter 1, Part 2, but she didn't know what happened next. She knew that, in the original, he was strong enough to escape the cave on his own, but since she changed the plot, he probably wouldn't be as active as he was in the novel. At that very moment, she looked intently at her companion and declared that, for his sake, she had taken responsibility upon herself. He was taken aback and froze in place with embarrassment. Rubian asked if he wanted to stay in the nearest village. She knew it would be great if he was in the main castle, but she herself lived there as a parasite. He thought about her words for a moment, but at that moment she stated that they could communicate with each other anyway, so distance was not a problem for them. He sighed and stated that she didn't know the meaning of the phrase, "no problem." At that moment, he said that he had recently wondered if it was hard for her to live without using mana. She looked at him, surprised, as she had not expected such a question. At that very moment, she was so happy that at least someone was raising her true pain. Khalid said with a smile that he found the capital harsh and therefore wanted to share his mana with it. A moment later, he began transmitting power. She happily rushed to hug him as she realized that the oath was still a good thing because they could share mana. Khalid asked in surprise why she left her recharge. Rubian was surprised that he remembered such a thing. He said with a smile that he remembered everything she had ever said. At that moment, she was overjoyed, as she had not felt a surge of mana for a long time. She joyfully shouted that he was the best. But after some time, she sighed heavily and said that she hated him. She was furious, and so he blocked her again after just one day. The Duke approached the boy and called him to breakfast, but at that very moment, he saw that he was some kind of witness. He asked if he had not been sleeping. Rubian, tearing off the ribbon, greeted the Duke. At the same moment, she declared that she slept well, as always, but the Duke saw that this was not so. He asked if he would continue to block his passage. She stated that it was unfair of him to watch her while she slept, and that she actually had personal boundaries. No matter how stupid she was, if he continued to check on her every night, he would definitely start to suspect something and realize that something was wrong with her. So she had to take drastic measures and forbid anyone from entering her room while she was sleeping in case she accidentally talked in her sleep or revealed her identity. Rubian understood that if he stepped over the tape with his long legs, she, of course, would not be able to stop him. At that very moment, Lion approached them and greeted the Duke, as well as the young gentleman. At that moment, he handed the young gentleman a small snack. She thanked him with a smile, but she did not know why he was carrying snacks with him. And, in turn, she assumed that he had low blood sugar. The Duke looked at the young man in surprise and asked what had brought him to him. Lion stated that he had come to request permission to open recruitment into the Order in preparation for the upcoming spring suppression. At that very moment, the young lady shouted that he would finally stop being the youngest. Lion declared that, unfortunately, it was unlikely that anyone younger than her would join. At that very moment, he handed the lady a wonderful milkshake. She thanked him with a smile, and at the same time thought that he had some kind of magic bag. The Duke told his subordinate to hire as many knights as possible. He also told the younger one that he should eat treats only after breakfast. She looked at the Duke with a smile and asked if she could go shopping after they ate. She wanted to make sure of her friend as soon as possible. Some time later, the Duke was sitting in his office, chaotically sorting through documents. But in turn, he was deeply puzzled, and at the same time he sighed heavily. Lion, looking at the Duke, he stated that someday the younger gentleman would see this side of him. The Duke shouted that he had lost his motivation to work because he was not around. Leviathan said that the boy had been busy training and playing outside lately, and they hadn't even had time to eat together. A moment later, the Duke was informed that the physician had arrived. The man looked closely at the Duke and stated that regarding the examination of the young master, carried out the other day, he was physically healthy. The Duke looked closely at the physician, as he wanted to know more detailed information about the boy's health. The man stated that because the boy avoided physical contact, they only ran basic tests, and all of them showed good results. It was also important to note that the boy was developing more slowly than his peers, not because of illness. However, the fact that he avoided touching worried him greatly, as he saw that the boy was wary of people. The man said with a smile that there was certainly good news. He had grown considerably since arriving at the castle, and if the young master continued to eat well, his growth would accelerate. The Duke sighed heavily. Since he saw that the boy had grown in a few weeks, he wanted to know how small his meals had been before. At that very moment, the Duke asked if anyone could go to Josiah. The doctor said that he had studied there and that it was quite possible. The Duke declared that the boy had been born there, and he would like to look for one of his relatives. The Duke wanted to wait until he himself told him everything, but he could not stand it any longer. He understood that he needed to find out as soon as possible what his life had been like before. Temporarily or not, he was now the boy's guardian, so he wanted to know everything about the child, because this was the only way he could protect him. Of course, the Duke hoped that he had only imagined it all, but he could not shake off his disturbing thoughts. He assumed that the little boy was hiding something from him. The man looked intently at the Duke and declared that he understood everything and would immediately try to find out something. But at that very moment, the man asked the Duke if it was true that the boy had created the herbal medicine. The Duke stated that it was so, and he said that he had learned it by observing his relatives. The man said that he heard that the boy even invented an ointment in the form of a plaster, and this is simply amazing, because if you take all this into account, he had amazing abilities. At that moment, the man was taken aback, as he saw an unfamiliar reaction. The Duke, without wasting a minute, declared that the boy was simply a genius. At that very moment, the doctor declared that this was not entirely true. But a moment later, he saw the Duke's menacing look and changed his mind, as he was quick to respond. So he declared that the boy was indeed much more experienced than his peers. At that very moment, he asked the Duke if he could take the boy as an apprentice. Since he was so knowledgeable about herbs, it would be useful to teach him the healing art as well. For some time, the man looked at the Duke intently, and at the same time, he tried to persuade him. But the Duke was adamant. A moment later, the Duke declared that there must be at least some decent excuse, and if the boy gave his permission, he could teach him. The Duke looked into the distance with a smile, because he realized that since he had gotten himself into something like this, he should give the boy a herbalist's shop. After all, he was interested in herbs, and perhaps such a gift would be to his liking. After some time, the Duke walked towards his sons, but he froze for a moment when he heard the conversation of his knights, who were happily discussing their daughters. The young man said with joy that he was about to burst with pride, and he would even like to show them a portrait of his daughter. All the other knights looked at the sweet girl with joy and admiration. The young man smiled and said that he wanted to leave work as soon as possible to see his daughter. He knew that he had received the most important treasure in the world. Children were rarely born in the north. Moreover, like a divine blessing from the harsh land, monsters were born. Most of the newborns were boys, making the girls even more precious. Therefore, to make a knight out of a daughter is almost blasphemy, so the knights' women were a rarity in the squads. Meanwhile, the young people continued to communicate with each other, discussing the Northern Knights Club with their daughters. The Duke was surprised, as he did not expect such a club to exist. Lion. At that very moment, he looked at everyone present and declared that they should not mention the Daughters' Club or anything like that in the presence of the Duke. They supported their mentor since they were of sound mind, and had no intention of bragging about their daughters in front of the Duke. The Duke was taken aback for a moment, as he did not understand why his friend was in such a community, but after their words, it became more difficult for him to take a step. The young man looked intently at his friends and declared that he felt very embarrassed about going to the capital. They were puzzled and said that he shouldn't say such a thing because going to the capital meant that he would no longer have to worry about not seeing his family again. They happily supported him and asked him to send letters. A moment later, the Duke turned around and walked away, but he said that he missed his younger brother very much. Meanwhile, the young lady was screaming inside herself in confusion, as she had told her friend to wait for her at the magic stone shop. She didn't understand where he had gone. She was worried because he blocked her again. At that very moment, the maid approached the young master and asked what had happened, as he had a serious face. Rubian was taken aback because she did not understand why her maid had pulled out a knife. The maid said that he needed to solve all the problems. She was shocked, but decided to let this moment pass. At that very moment, the young lady turned around as she heard the old man greeting her with joy. Rubian. It was noticeable that the old man held the blacksmith in a tenacious grip, but she could see that he was not in the best condition. At that very moment, the man shouted that it was all because there was no work in the forge. She was surprised and assumed that the blacksmith would close, but the Lord said that this was not the case, and now it was just a lull. Not like during the war, but there was still enough work, and the man was in a despondent state, because now there was no opportunity to create new weapons. The Lord stated that he took the man with him because he did not want to see him moping around doing nothing. At that very moment, he asked the boy if he wanted to go with them. The Lord said he heard that a candidate had appeared, who hoped to join their nightly order. After some time, the young lady looked at her comrade in the distance, stunned. Khalid, without wasting a minute, submitted the application form. At this point, she froze in shock on the spot. Since he had lost contact with her, he still came and filed a statement. The Lord was surprised that the boy had written a statement in advance. He also noted that the boy looked like a slippery type, but surprisingly, he was brave. At that very moment, Rubian signaled to her comrade to behave quietly and pretend that they did not know each other. The Lord read this application, and in surprise, asked the boy who he wanted to catch. He wrote about his many experiences as a mercenary, and he also stated the reason for his admission, as he intended to catch his childhood friend. But at that very moment, he took back his statement. A few seconds later, he made some minor amendments to the statement. He corrected the reason for admission and wrote that he wanted to bring back his childhood friend. At that very moment, he made a small cut on his finger and provided his fingerprint on the document. They looked at him in surprise, but at that very moment, he declared that he did not have a separate seal. The Lord shouted that the boy was very strange, and he really wanted to know who his childhood friend was. Khalid pointed his finger at them, and at that moment, the Lord was taken aback, since he was not his childhood friend at all. At that very moment, the young man came closer to them and declared that this was not so, and he was talking now about the doll boy who was in the Lord's arms, because this child was his childhood friend. The Lord asked in surprise if he was already a friend of their little bug. Khalid asked in surprise what he was talking about. At the same time, the young lady sighed heavily, as she had told the Lord many times not to say such words. Khalid looked at the Duke and said that judging by his friend's face, he missed him. Khalid asked the Duke if he could ask his permission to join the order. The Duke stared at the boy for a moment, but after a moment he asked if the boy was really 12 years old and had experience as a mercenary. Khalid, looking at the Duke, declared that everything was correct. Then the Duke asked the boy if he was really a child soldier of the kingdom. The young lady was taken aback, as she realized that the same questions would soon be applied to her. Khalid stated that he was merely a messenger for a roving mercenary group. At that very moment, the Duke declared that it seemed they had met in Josiah. He understood that calling them childhood friends was an exaggeration. At that moment, the Duke asked Ruby what she liked most in food. Khalid easily answered that it was bell pepper. The Duke asked what the boy liked most. Khalid declared that it was a bath and a warm, cozy bed. She was shocked because she saw that the Duke was bombarding the young man with questions, so at that very moment, she jumped out of the Lord's arms and ran towards them. She shielded the young man with her body, and declared that they should stop their senseless argument, because he was her friend. After some time, they were supposed to begin testing his skills. The Lord looked with a satisfied smile at the several candidates who were eager to fight. Rubian knew it would be great if her friend came through and was nearby, but she understood that it meant that both had to hide their identities, and that increased the risk of exposure. The Duke looked closely at the boy and said with a smile that he did not know if he knew, but their knightly order did not take people by connections. She stated with a smile that it simply could not be that such a respected knightly order recruited by connections. The Duke stated with a smile that they chose only the strongest, but now they accepted everyone as they were catastrophically short of hands. At the same time, the Lord shouted with a joyful smile, as he wanted to see what the boy was capable of. Oberon looked closely at everyone present and stated that they must choose an opponent one at a time. He also stated that the rules were simple. Looking at everyone present, he said that it was a one-on-one fight, and the one with more white powder on their clothes would lose. But at the same time, they had to forget about age and give it their all. At that very moment, the first candidates for pain were chosen. The young man looked at the boy with puzzlement. Meanwhile, Khalid stared intently at his opponent, while maintaining calm and concentration. Balrog, looking at the baby, asked if the child had any skills. She stated that he should be able to handle the basics. She knew perfectly well that her friend was an unregistered magician from the Magic Kingdom, which meant that up until that moment, he had been surviving by trying to avoid being seen by the Magic Kingdom, and that he had not used magic at all. But it was also proof of his exceptional swordsmanship. From the very beginning, he preferred the sword to magic with many limitations, so she used magic in the rear. He fought with the ball, and together they destroyed countless black creatures. Under pressure from criticism for using child soldiers, the Mage King, in order to discreetly use young mages, sent them to the habitats of black creatures still unknown to the world. And in the end, she too was thrown into those places, and she went through a lot. But her friend secretly entered such a dangerous place and was always by her side, helping her. She sighed heavily as warm memories came flooding back. But at the same time, she understood that he had been holding back his abilities until the very end. After some time, the Lord asked Rubian in surprise, "Can his friend really cope with something like this?" At the same time, the young lady was in shock. She did not understand why he did not win. After some time, the young man looked intently at his new opponent. The young lady was puzzled and did not understand what had happened. She wondered if she had let her guard down, but she knew that this time her friend would win. After some time, the young man lost again, and his opponent shouted with joy and informed everyone of his victory. The Lord looked closely at the boy, since he could not tell from his appearance that he was stupid. At the same moment, the Duke asked the boy if he had said earlier that his friend was a mercenary. At that very moment, the Duke grabbed the cookie and threw it towards the boy. Khalid, in turn, froze for a moment as he sensed the approach of the unknown. A moment later, he realized something, and frozen, stared intently at the approaching object. At that very moment, he struck his opponent, and he fell to the ground. But he managed to hold him back. He pointed his sword, defending himself. But a moment later, he threw his trusty sword to meet the flying object. The Duke looked at this intently. A moment later, the Duke drew his sword from its sheath, as he realized that something terrible had clearly happened. The Duke was able to easily cut through his opponent's wooden sword. At that very moment, he looked intently at the boy, who was glaring at him with a cold and angry gaze. Khalid asked the man for forgiveness, because he sensed murderous intent. The man was shocked because he realized that the boy was using him as a shield. A moment later, the Duke declared that they would end the test with this, since he intended to place everyone into the knightly order. The young lady looked at her friend with a smile, as she understood that he had ultimately made everything as suspicious as possible. At that very moment, the Duke looked at the boy, as he realized that he was not a messenger at all, but a mobilized veteran. The Duke said that judging by the way he reacted to the real intent to kill, he was clearly not used to pretend fights. The young lady was shocked as she realized that he threw the cookie at her friend with the intent to kill. He asked his ward if he was close to the boy. She was taken aback and stated that he was. The Duke stated that when the boy felt the urge to kill, the first one he checked was Rubian. After some time, the trio joined the knightly order without further ado. But the young lady, in turn, was very puzzled, since her friend had been accepted, and she was still the youngest. The Duke said the boy had had an extensive career. The young lady was shocked because she realized that she was in a heartless world. She screamed that this was unfair. Khalid looked at his friend with a satisfied smile, and after a moment, he declared that, judging by her words, Anna had settled in quite well. How recently she had clung to the old man like a wind-up doll. She sighed heavily, and looking at her friend in surprise, asked if he really intended to settle in such a place. He stated that this was so, and that he had already been given a room, and would soon be given a uniform. Khalid looked at his friend in surprise, and asked if she was offended. She said that she had no reason to be offended, because he would go his own way anyway, without consulting her. At that very moment, the young man touched his girlfriend and transferred his power to her. He looked at her tenderly and asked her not to be offended by him. He also asked her to stop making eyes at him when she was taking away his mana. A moment later, she couldn't take it anymore and hit him. After some time, they finally settled their issues. She understood that since things had turned out this way, she needed to launch her plan for absolute happiness. She understood that her friend could gain experience from the best knights of the continent. She knew that such experience would come in handy when he overthrew the Magician King. Rubian said with a smile that now he must become stronger and must train better. He wondered if he really needed to do something like that until the Duke went to cut off the sorcerer's head. She asked in surprise if he had read her mind, but he said that was not the case. He said that while he was getting to her, he was racking his brains. Why would she stay in such a place? He wanted to know if she really intended to kill the King of Magicians with the help of the Duke. If he asked if it was because her cursed brand prevented her from doing something like that herself, at that very moment, she used her magic and made a barrier over them. He realized that she had used silence magic, and at that moment, he declared that he would destroy the king with his own hands, and that he did not need either the magical vault or the Duke's help. She sighed and declared that this was not a vault at all, but a spell. One day, she told her friend that in order to free the world from the shackles of the sorcerer, he must be destroyed. Since then, he clenched his teeth and repeated that he would kill the king himself. She assumed that he had figured out her plan, because he already knew everything in advance, but at the same moment, she declared that he was still too naive. Khalid, holding back his rage, stated that this was the reason she was here. He understood that they were about to have a serious conversation. All this time, the lady did not understand what he wanted to tell her. He knew the Duke was strong and he hated magicians, so she believed he could deal with the sorcerer. But the Duke of the Empire would not kill the king of a neighboring state without a good reason. She sighed heavily, because she knew it was the absolute truth. But she also knew that the king had done a lot of harm. The waters of the Kingdom of Mages are an island. They were already walking on the edge of a knife with the continent, but they seriously planned to absorb the continent with childish ambitions of world domination. The order to capture the Black Magician alive was not given without reason, but the plan failed because the Leviathan found out about this and killed the Black Magician. Since it was common knowledge that the king carried only threats, if only the Duke remained alive, he could save them from such a headache. The young man looked intently at his companion and declared that Anna had taken up her ways again. He wanted to at least get a glimpse into her thoughts. She sighed and stated that it was simply impossible, since she had many secrets. He declared that he would kill the king for making her suffer. Khalid said that he had made this his main goal, but at that very moment, he started talking about the Duke. Looking at his girlfriend, he said that if she relied on him as the strongest, he would become stronger than her. Rubian, in turn, was amazed by what she heard, but as if enchanted, she asked him to try to become stronger. He smiled and said that she should root for him. After some time, the young lady looked at the new family business in surprise. Since her friend was invited as a family friend, she knew that her grandfather always ate alone in a separate room. Boyd asked his father in surprise when he had managed to bring another child from the capital. The young lady stated that this child was her friend, who had recently joined them. The Lord looked closely at his grandson and said that he had previously asked him to come and watch the entrance exams. Boyd was shocked and said that he could not even imagine that the younger one's friend would come to the exam. He said that if he hadn't been shirking, his grandfather would have dragged him away and given him a training session. The young man, in turn, looked intently at everyone present and at their petty squabbles. Khalid, looking at his friend, said that she had settled in well in this booth, although she did not like noisy places. She said with a smile that this was not a booth. At that moment, the young man thanked them all as he had enjoyed the meal and therefore wanted to leave. The Lord was in shock. Rubian was surprised and told her friend to eat, but a moment later, she saw that he had eaten everything. She was surprised because he took care of her and observed etiquette at the same time, but she realized that his speed was incredible. But at that very moment, she wondered when he had managed to learn noble etiquette. Khalid looked at everyone present from behind and said that his friend didn't like fried bell peppers, so they had to change the recipe. She was shocked because she didn't expect to hear something like that. The Lord shouted that this was impudence on his part. At that very moment, the young lady sighed heavily, as she could no longer tolerate such a farce. The Duke only looked at them with a satisfied smile. At that very moment, he declared that the baby must eat every last crumb today. She sighed and agreed with him. At that very moment, the young man left them with a satisfied smile. At the same time, the Lord thought about what was coming with a smile. The Lord couldn't stand it and shouted that the kid was just a stupid brat and that he was very impudent. Rubian said with a smile that they shouldn't be too angry with him, since he lacked social skills due to a hard life from a young age. At that very moment, the Duke declared with a smile that he liked even his bad character very much. At that moment, the Duke looked at his father and declared that he had been bored lately, and for that reason, he could take Khalid and Boyd and train them. The Duke knew that the appearance of a rival would make his son's training several times more effective. After some time, the young lady returned to her place with a smile, but a moment later, her brother ran up to her. She was taken aback as she did not expect to see him. She looked at him in surprise and asked what happened. Since he was very heavy, Boyd asked the younger one if he had really read his diary again. She claimed she was just checking his spelling, asking if he realized how hard it was. He was taken aback and shouted that it was a huge amount of work. At the same time, she noted that he should thank her for something like this. A moment later, the young man stated that Khalid was about the same age as his brother, but for some reason he was taller than him. She smiled and stated that her friend was 12 years old, and at the same time, she was mature because she had older friends. Boyd asked the younger one in surprise if they were close. She stated that they were very close, but at the same time, he was angry because they were brothers, and he understood that the younger one should not have anyone closer. She looked at him in surprise and said that he also had friends. He understood that this was true, but he still didn't like this kind of thing. After a moment, she decided to leave. As she realized that he would not answer her question, she said that she needed to brush her teeth, and the sink was very high, and she didn't know what to do, so she wanted to find trustworthy brother and ask him for help. A moment later, the older, reliable brother was helping his younger one. She smiled and was happy, so she saw that he was no longer angry. They were happy to engage in casual conversation while they were busy with work. After some time, the Lord shouted that on the battlefield he was not their grandfather. Apparently, from their actions, he would become a demon or a dragon. The young man looked at his grandfather intently and declared that he was already a demon. The man laughed and asked what the point of keeping an angel on the battlefield was. At that moment, all the knights turned around as they did not understand what he was doing. At that very moment, the Lord declared that the young men would first engage in sparring so that he could evaluate their skills. The young lady was shocked and screamed that this was not fair. The Lord shouted and asked if they were ready to run. She sighed heavily as she realized what kind of sparring it was. After a short explanation, she looked at everyone present with a joyful smile, as she realized that this was a rather wonderful and fun activity. At that very moment, she began her warm-up. Rubian said with a smile that since she had done her warm-up, she intended to join them. At that very moment, the Lord caught the fugitive and declared that he would not go, as he might be blown away by the wind. Rubian was shocked and shouted that she was also a recruit and needed training, but the Lord had a different opinion. She was shocked and screamed that he was discriminating against her. He was taken aback and stated that this was not discrimination at all. At that very moment, she shouted with a joyful smile, "Well, it's time for them to have fun." Khalid looked at his friend in surprise, as he noticed that she had grown up. She asked with admiration if he had noticed anything like that, since she had grown a little since she arrived at the mansion. He came closer to her and said that she had really grown up, because her eyes were lower than the ranch. But at that very moment, the young man stood between them, and thus pushed Khalid away. Boyd yelled at him for getting too close to his brother. Khalid asked in surprise what had happened. Boyd, in turn, only looked menacingly at the young man, grinning. But a moment later, he was taken aback, as he could not say anything in reply to his opponent. He knew that something was bothering him, but he didn't know what it was, because he had a feeling that he had heard something like this before. Earlier, his friend said that his younger sister bought a house for her boyfriend, but he didn't like the young man at all. Boyd looked at his friend in surprise and asked if he just hated the guy because he was his sister's boyfriend. The boy stated that his friend understood everything, even though he didn't have a sister. He understood perfectly well what was going on now. At the same time, he was lost in his thoughts, noticing nothing at that moment. The young lady announced that she would begin. As she ran away, she said with a smile that they should run faster. Boyd was shocked because he knew that was the problem. He was screaming that his little brother was too small and cute. For this reason, he, like an older brother, was constantly worried. A moment later, he finally started running, but to his regret, he fell to the ground with a crash. Khalid turned around and told the boy with a smile that his shoelaces were untied and he should be careful. Boyd was furious because he knew that his opponent did it on purpose.